He never expected his quiet morning service to expose the largest corrupt criminal empire in the Arizona desert. When 5 members of a notorious outlaw gang enter a church and begin to laugh at the preacher, mocking him as a feeble man of God, they had no idea they were messing with the once feared gunslinger known as Silver Bullet Sam, the man who single-handedly took down the West's most notorious gang, the Thunderclaps. Reverend Samuel Carter is a preacher who leads a simple life, struggling with the physical toll of a past he's tried to bury. His once sturdy leg now limps with every step, a reminder of a battle fought long ago. When Hawkins and his rugged band of outlaws decided to harass the town's quiet preacher at his church, they thought they'd found an easy target. Instead, they set into motion a chain of events that would make these outlaws wish they had never stumbled across the dusty, forgotten town of Crossbones Ridge. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because tomorrow we have a special story for you. Crossbones Ridge, like so many other towns that the railroad had passed by, was a place that time had left behind. It sat at the edge of the Arizona desert, where the sun beat down relentlessly, and the smell of dust and old wood permeated the air. The town was small, made up of crooked buildings, saloons with swinging doors that barely moved, and a few scattered homes, all sunken low as if the earth itself was trying to swallow them whole. It was late afternoon when Reverend Samuel Carter limped slowly down the wooden steps of his small church. He paused at the bottom, resting a hand on the railing, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the pain from his old leg flared up. It was the kind of pain that never truly left, only hid, waiting for the right moment to strike. The preacher was a man who had once commanded respect, no fear, across the West. But those days felt like a lifetime ago, and now he was just a quiet man with a limp, wearing the dull robes of a preacher, tending to a town that had long since abandoned the hope of salvation. As the sun began to set, casting long, orange streaks across the horizon, Carter caught sight of a group of men riding into town. They were familiar faces, outlaws who had been terrorizing Crossbones Ridge for months. Hawkins, their leader, was the one who always rode in front, a cruel smile plastered across his face, his eyes sharp and calculating. His gang of misfits followed him like dogs, their horses kicking up dust as they approached the saloon. Carter knew trouble was inevitable when they rolled into town. Hawkins and his men were well known in the region, feared by anyone who had the misfortune of crossing their path. They had been robbing, stealing, and causing chaos wherever they went, and Crossbones Ridge had become their latest target. As the outlaws dismounted and sauntered into the saloon, Carter slowly turned and made his way back to the church, his hand gripping the wooden doorframe for balance. He had seen enough violence in his life to know that these men wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But what was a preacher to do against such men? He had no power here, no influence. His only weapon was his faith. But in a town like this, faith didn't count for much. Inside the church, Carter knelt before the altar, his weathered hands resting on the cool wood. He closed his eyes and prayed, not for himself, but for the people of Crossbones Ridge. He prayed for the strength to stand firm in the face of whatever might come. He hadn't heard the door open, but the sound of heavy boots scraping across the floor made him open his eyes. 2 of Hawkins' men stood in the doorway, grinning as they looked down at the preacher. The larger of the 2, a man with a crooked nose and a scar that ran from his cheek to his chin, spat on the floor in front of Carter. "Look what we got here," the man sneered. "The good old preacher man, praying like he can save this godforsaken place." Carter didn't flinch. He didn't react. He simply looked up at them with calm, steady eyes. "Is there something I can help you with, gentlemen?" he asked in a voice that was soft but firm, the kind of voice that had once commanded respect in every town he entered. The smaller man, his face young and unmarked, snickered. "I don't think you can help us with anything, preacher," he said, "but maybe you can help us with a laugh." The 2 men chuckled, their eyes scanning Carter's frail form. They could see the limp that was now a permanent part of him, the way his hand gripped the pew for support. They saw a man broken by time and circumstance, a man who no longer posed any danger. "We heard you used to be something special, preacher," the scarred man said, drawing a slow circle in the air with his finger. as if tracing the outline of Carter's past. But look at you now. Just an old man playing dress-up in a church. The young man laughed again, his voice shrill with mockery. Yeah, Silver Bullet Sam, the gunslinger. What happened to you? You get old? Or just too soft to fight? Carter's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something darker crossing his face. The name, Silver Bullet Sam, still carried weight, even after all these years. They didn't know, couldn't know, that the man who once wiped out a gang of thieves, bloodied and outnumbered, now spent his days tending to the souls of a town that barely acknowledged him. They didn't know what he had done, who he had killed, or the weight of the lives he had taken. Carter pushed himself up from the pew, his leg giving a sharp twinge of pain. He wasn't going to let these men see him flinch. He wasn't going to let them see weakness. He turned slowly, walking towards the back of the church where the door to the small storage room creaked open. The two men followed him with their eyes, amusement still dancing in their gazes. "You gonna show us your collection of holy books, preacher?" the young man mocked. Carter stopped at the storage room, his fingers brushing the edge of a small, dusty wooden box. Inside it lay a revolver, its barrel worn smooth by years of use. His old gun, the one that had saved his life countless times. The one he had sworn he would never fire again. But as the door swung shut behind him, Carter's mind shifted. He knew what he had to do. The two outlaws laughed louder now, thinking the preacher was just hiding, too afraid to face them. But as the door creaked open again, and Carter stepped out, a chilling silence filled the air. His eyes had changed. There was a fire in them that hadn't been there moments before. It was a fire that burned with the heat of old memories, of gunfire and bloodshed. He wasn't just Reverend Samuel Carter anymore. He was Silver Bullet Sam again. The two outlaws froze at the sight of Reverend Samuel Carter emerging from the storage room. There was something about him now, something that made the air feel heavier, like the town itself was holding its breath. Gone was the feeble preacher. In his place stood a man with a calm, deadly presence that felt like a storm waiting to break. His hand rested lightly on the grip of the revolver, but the movement was steady, practiced. The gun that had once earned him the nickname Silver Bullet Sam was no longer a relic. It was an extension of his arm, as natural to him as the air he breathed. The young outlaw, still holding his grin, stepped forward, but his bravado faltered. He saw the look in Carter's eyes, something more dangerous than a mere man of God, something that spoke of a past filled with violence, blood, and death. The scarred man beside him stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol holstered at his side. "You think you're gonna threaten us with that, preacher?" The young outlaw sneered, though his voice now held a tremor, as if unsure. "You're nothing but a limp old man." But Carter didn't flinch. He took a step forward, the wooden floor creaking beneath his boots. The revolver gleamed in the dim light of the church, and the cold steel sent a clear message. The preacher was no longer the victim. He was a hunter. "Do you know who I am?" Carter asked, his voice low, like the hum of a distant thunderstorm. He didn't wait for an answer. "I'm the man who brought down the Thunderclaps." The name seemed to hit the outlaws like a slap. The Thunderclaps were infamous, vicious, relentless, and unchallenged. A gang that had terrorized the West for years, feared by everyone from lawmen to bounty hunters. And Carter had killed every last one of them. Every last one. For a moment, the two men stood speechless, their bravado cracking. The scarred outlaw's hand trembled on his holster, and the young man's grin faltered. They had heard the stories, but they hadn't believed them. How could they? A preacher? One man against a gang like that? Impossible. Carter took another step, his limp barely noticeable now as adrenaline and purpose took hold of him. The gun was steady in his hand, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He wasn't here to talk, to plead, or to reason. The time for words had passed. "Leave," Carter said, his voice like gravel grinding beneath a boot. "Or I'll show you what a real man can do." The scarred man swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air in the church. He glanced at the younger outlaw, looking for confirmation. The two men exchanged a glance, a silent conversation, and then, like a bad decision being made in slow motion, Hawkins' men drew their guns. It was almost too slow. Carter's hands moved like lightning. In one smooth motion, the preacher raised his revolver, and the deafening crack of gunfire shattered the silence of the church. The scarred outlaw's hand jerked back, his gun flying from his grip as the bullet ripped through his wrist. He howled in pain, but before he could react, Carter's second shot rang out. The bullet tore through the man's side, sending him sprawling to the ground in a heap of blood and dust. The young outlaw had no time to react, his mouth still open in shock as he reached for his gun. Carter's third shot found its mark, piercing the young man's chest before he could even draw his weapon. The entire exchange took less than 2 seconds. Carter lowered the revolver, the smoke still curling from the barrel, as if it were exhaling a long-held breath. The two outlaws lay on the floor in a pool of their own blood, unmoving. The church was deathly quiet, save for the faint echoes of the gunfire and the soft rustle of the wind outside. Carter's heart was steady, his breathing calm. He felt no thrill, no rush of victory. There was only the cold, distant satisfaction of doing what had to be done. For a moment, he stood still, the weight of his actions sinking in, the taste of gunpowder still lingering in his mouth. But then the door of the church opened, and a voice called out, "Preacher, you all right in there?" It was the voice of Sheriff Jackson, a man who had come to Crossbones Ridge in hopes of keeping the peace. But in a town like this, peace was a dream, and Jackson was more of a spectator than a protector. Carter didn't answer at first. He stood over the bodies of the two men, his gaze distant as if searching for something that wasn't there. The past, maybe. A time when he was someone else. Finally, he holstered the revolver and turned toward the door. "I'm fine, Sheriff," Carter said, his voice cool and calm. "Just a little dust up." Sheriff Jackson stepped into the church, his eyes immediately going to the two dead outlaws sprawled across the floor. His eyes widened, and his hand instinctively moved toward his holster. "What the hell happened here, Carter?" the sheriff asked, his voice tense. You shot them?" Carter gave a slow nod, but his face remained impassive. "They drew first," he said quietly. "They didn't want to leave." The sheriff's gaze flickered back to the outlaws, and for a moment, Carter could see the wheels turning in the lawman's head. He had heard the stories of Silver Bullet Sam, but he had always assumed they were just that, stories. Sheriff Jackson began, but his voice faltered as he tried to reconcile the man he knew with the legend. "You're Silver Bullet Sam, aren't you?" Carter didn't respond. He simply turned and walked toward the door, his limp more pronounced now, but still purposeful. "I was," he said quietly over his shoulder. "I was." As he left the church, the sun had almost set, the orange light casting long shadows across the town. Crossbones Ridge felt eerily still, as if the very air had changed. The wind whispered through the streets, but no one dared speak aloud. The preacher was no longer just a man of God. He was something more, a living legend, and the outlaws who had once mocked him would soon come to regret the day they crossed his path. The next morning, Crossbones Ridge felt different. The usual chatter of the town's few remaining residents had quieted, as if they, too, could feel the shifting atmosphere. Even the wind seemed to hesitate as it blew across the dirt streets, swirling dust in lazy circles. Reverend Samuel Carter, Silver Bullet Sam, had become something of a myth in the eyes of the town. Some had heard rumors, whispered stories of his past as a gunslinger, but most had written them off as exaggerated tales spun by those with too much time on their hands. Yet, after the events of the night before, the people of Crossbones Ridge could no longer ignore the truth. The preacher had once been the deadliest man in the West, and now he had returned to settle an old score. As the sun rose over the mountains, Carter was already in the saddle, his steely gaze fixed on the horizon. He had no real destination in mind. He was waiting for something. For them. The outlaws had not been the only ones to hear the shots ring out the night before. The entire town had witnessed the quick, decisive justice that had unfolded inside the church. It didn't take long for word to spread that the preacher had killed 2 of Hawkins' men. The gang would be furious, and they wouldn't rest until they had exacted their revenge. And Hawkins, Carter knew Hawkins. He was no fool. He wouldn't let this slight go unpunished. The preacher's heart was heavy, but not for the reasons one might think. He wasn't burdened by guilt over the lives he had taken, nor was he filled with dread about what might come next. No, Carter felt the weight of something far more familiar. The call to fight once more. It had been a long time since he had felt the thrill of the draw, the rush of the gunfire, the finality of the death that followed. He had buried that man years ago, buried him beneath the robes and the humble life he had chosen. But now, the violence had come to him once again, and the man of God was forced to remember what lay buried in the depths of his soul. His horse, a steady mare named Misty, moved with a rhythmic cadence, carrying him along the dirt roads toward the edge of town. Carter knew the terrain well. He had ridden these trails many times before, and he could sense that Hawkins and his gang weren't far behind. But it wasn't Hawkins himself Carter was worried about, not yet. The gang leader was dangerous, yes, but he was predictable. The real threat came from the men who followed him. They were vicious, unruly, and they all had something to prove. Hawkins had a reputation for being a ruthless leader, but it was his men who were truly wild, who would stop at nothing to tear a man apart. As Carter neared the old abandoned mine at the outskirts of town, he pulled Misty to a stop. He dismounted and stood still for a moment, eyes scanning the barren landscape before him. The wind kicked up, rustling the dry grass as if the land itself was whispering to him. The feeling in the air had shifted. It was heavier now, charged with the anticipation of an inevitable confrontation. Reaching for the revolver at his side, Carter gripped the cold steel and tested its weight in his palm. He could hear the soft, metallic click of the chamber spinning, a sound that once signaled the beginning of a fight. He wasn't sure who would come first, but he knew it wouldn't be long. As the morning passed, Carter found himself standing in the shadow of the old mine, the sun creeping higher in the sky. The smell of dust and metal filled the air, and for the first time in years, he felt the rush of something familiar, something primal. Then, through the haze of the morning heat, he saw them. A group of 5 riders, their silhouettes outlined against the dusty landscape, riding hard toward him. They were moving fast, kicking up a cloud of dirt as they approached, their horses' hooves pounding against the earth in a steady, deafening rhythm. Carter didn't move. He didn't need to. He knew exactly who they were. Hawkins' men. The riders came closer, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, their expressions hard as stone. Carter didn't flinch as they pulled their horses to a stop just a few feet away. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek, dismounted first, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. The others followed, each one sizing up the preacher with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "You're the preacher, huh?" the leader asked, his voice gruff and laced with venom. He looked Carter up and down, taking in the man's worn clothes, his limp, and the revolver that hung at his side. "I'll admit, I didn't think you'd have the guts to face us after last night." Carter didn't answer. He just stared at the man with the cold, unwavering gaze that had once made even the toughest gunslingers hesitate. There was no need for words. The silence between them spoke volumes. The leader spat on the ground, then reached for the revolver at his hip. "You made a mistake last night, preacher. You killed 2 of our men, and for that you're gonna pay." Carter's hand twitched toward his own gun, the weight of it familiar and comforting. He could feel the tension in the air now, thick and charged, like the calm before a storm. The outlaws weren't just looking for a fight. They were looking for blood. But Carter was no longer just a preacher. He was Silver Bullet Sam, the man who had outgunned the deadliest gang in the West. And the gang that stood before him was about to learn what that meant. The leader's fingers brushed the grip of his gun, and in that instant, Carter moved. The preacher's revolver was out of its holster and aimed squarely at the leader's chest before the man could even blink. The flash of gunfire was deafening, and the outlaws staggered back, momentarily disoriented by the sudden violence. The leader fell to the ground, clutching his chest, his eyes wide in shock. The others froze, staring at Carter in disbelief. He had moved too fast, too precise. Without missing a beat, Carter's eyes scanned the remaining men. They were no longer sure of themselves, their bravado shattered in an instant. "I'll say it once more," Carter said, his voice calm but deadly. "You leave this town, or I'll make sure there won't be anyone left to bury you." The wind shifted again, and for the first time since Carter had taken his first breath in this town, there was silence. Then, one of the outlaws dropped his gun. Another followed, and just like that, the storm had passed. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the desert brush. The 5 outlaws, still stunned by the speed and precision of Carter's response, stood frozen in place. Their leader, now lying in a pool of his own blood, stared up at the preacher in disbelief. Carter's hand was still steady on the grip of his revolver, the barrel warm from the shot, but his eyes were cold, calculating. He wasn't the preacher anymore. He was Silver Bullet Sam, a man forged in the fires of gunfights and death, and these outlaws were nothing more than prey. The first outlaw to drop his gun, a skinny man with a twitchy eye, took an uncertain step back, his eyes flickering between his fallen leader and Carter's gun. He wasn't a fighter. He was a survivor, and survival meant knowing when to flee. You're gonna kill all of us, ain't you?" the skinny man asked, his voice shaky, a bead of sweat rolling down his forehead despite the cool morning air. Carter didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. His eyes stayed on the group, unwavering, as if daring any one of them to make a move. The others had yet to draw their guns, and that was good enough for Carter. He wasn't here to execute men who had no fight left in them. But there was one last thing to do. "You've got a choice," Carter said slowly, his voice low but firm. "You can ride out of here, right now, and never come back. Or you can stay and fight." The words hung in the air like a challenge, like a line drawn in the sand. And as Carter watched the outlaws, he could almost see the internal struggle written on their faces. The fear, the doubt. The first man to break was the largest of the group. He was built like a bull, broad and thick, with a face hardened by years of violence. But even he knew when to fold. His gun dropped from his hand with a clatter, and his shoulders slumped. His eyes met Carter's, not with defiance, but with resignation. "Hell, we don't stand a chance," the big man muttered, stepping back. "I don't know what kind of monster you were back in the day, preacher, but I ain't gonna die over some petty grudge." The others followed his lead, one by one, dropping their weapons and backing away. Carter stood still, not moving an inch. His revolver never wavered, its barrel still smoking from the shot he had fired just moments ago. Without a word, the outlaws turned and began to mount their horses. They were silent now, no longer the cocky, rowdy gang that had once terrorized the West. They were broken, defeated before they had even drawn their guns. As they rode off into the distance, Carter watched them go, his eyes hard but unblinking. He wasn't satisfied. Not yet. He knew they would be back. Men like that never gave up. But for now, they had learned the hard way that the preacher they mocked had once been a force to be reckoned with. And that lesson would stay with them. When the last of the outlaws had disappeared over the ridge, Carter holstered his revolver and turned toward the town. The wind had shifted again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the heavy anticipation of battle. It was the calm after the storm. Crossbones Ridge had been shaken, but it hadn't yet realized the true extent of the change. As Carter walked back toward the town, his mind wandered, though he kept his focus ahead. He had already taken the first step. The outlaws had learned that there was more to him than the limp, the robe, the preacher's facade. But there was still much to be done. They would come back, he knew that. But this time, they wouldn't be expecting him. As Carter approached the outskirts of town, he could see a figure standing near the saloon. Sheriff Jackson. The lawman had clearly been watching the confrontation from a distance. His face was unreadable, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a mixture of awe and fear. Carter didn't blame him. A man like Jackson, used to dealing with petty criminals and drunks, would never fully understand the world Carter had come from. The sheriff tipped his hat as Carter approached, his voice steady but cautious. "I reckon that's the end of it then?" Jackson asked, his eyes flicking over to the horizon where the outlaws had vanished. Carter nodded slowly, but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't done with them. Not by a long shot. "The outlaws will be back," Carter said, his voice quiet, but certain. "They always come back. But they know now that this town has a protector." The sheriff frowned, but there was no denying the truth in Carter's words. "I never knew you were that man, Carter," he said, the respect in his tone clear now, even though it was tinged with the faintest trace of fear. "Hell, I've heard the stories, but I never thought they were anything more than just that. Stories have a way of becoming reality when people forget the truth," Carter replied, his gaze cold and unwavering. "And the truth is that men like Hawkins and his gang don't stop. They don't care about the law. They don't care about what's right. But they care about one thing, their lives. And if they want to keep them, they'll leave this town in peace." Sheriff Jackson nodded slowly, his eyes glancing back at the trail where the outlaws had disappeared. The wind picked up again, and the sheriff tugged at the brim of his hat, as if bracing himself for the storm that was sure to come. "You'll be ready for them, won't you?" Jackson asked, his voice quieter now. Carter didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. He simply turned, his coat trailing behind him like the shadow of a man who had once been someone else, someone much more dangerous. He had made his choice long ago. There was no turning back. "Always," Carter replied simply, his voice low but filled with the quiet confidence of a man who had walked through hell and come out the other side. As the preacher made his way back into town, the people of Crossbones Ridge began to stir, sensing that something had changed, something that couldn't be undone. They didn't yet understand what was to come, but they would. They would learn soon enough that Silver Bullet Sam was no myth, and when the outlaws came back, and they would meet a force unlike any they had ever faced. And Crossbones Ridge would never be the same. Days passed, and the weight of Carter's actions began to settle over Crossbones Ridge like a heavy blanket. The sun rose higher in the sky each morning, painting the town in harsh light, but it felt like the town itself had been cast in shadow. The residents, those few who still called the town home, moved cautiously through the streets, their eyes flickering nervously when they passed the church or saw Carter walking down the main road. No one had forgotten what they had witnessed. The outlaws' bodies had been left where they fell, a grim reminder to anyone who dared to test the preacher. For the first time in months, there was a strange stillness to the town. Hawkins' men had fled, but their absence seemed to amplify the sense of danger, as if a storm was gathering just beyond the horizon, waiting for the right moment to strike. Carter spent his days in the church, his sermons quieter now, less frequent. He had no interest in gathering a congregation. His purpose was elsewhere, buried deep within him. The violence, the bloodshed, it was all part of who he was. But it was also a necessary evil. The West had taught him that. Sheriff Jackson, meanwhile, did his best to maintain order in the town. He had no illusions about his own ability to control the situation. He had seen what Carter was capable of, and the sheriff wasn't foolish enough to think that a few outlaws were all that stood between Crossbones Ridge and chaos. It wasn't long before the quiet tension that hung in the air grew unbearable. The wind started to pick up again, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Then, one afternoon, the town was shaken by the sound of galloping hooves. The sheriff was the first to hear them. He was sitting on the porch of the small office that served as his headquarters, watching the town with weary eyes, when he heard the unmistakable pounding of horses' hooves. Jackson stood quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for his holstered revolver. But he didn't need to. He already knew who it was. Riding down the main road was a group of riders, 5 of them. Their horses kicked up dust as they approached, and the sheriff recognized the leader immediately. Hawkins. His face was as cold as ever, his eyes sharp and angry. The gang leader had a reputation for revenge, and he was never one to back down from a fight. Jackson's heart sank as Hawkins and his men pulled to a stop outside the sheriff's office. "Sheriff," Hawkins said, his voice smooth but laced with venom. "We've got a problem. We're missing 2 of our men." Jackson didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The answer was already clear. "You know what happened to them," Hawkins continued, his tone turning more menacing. "You saw it for yourself. That preacher, he shot him down without a second thought. Now, we're here to settle the score." The sheriff looked past Hawkins and his men, his gaze drifting toward the church. He could feel the pressure building in his chest. He knew what was coming. "They're gone, Hawkins," Jackson said finally, his voice steady, though there was a nervous tremor beneath it. "You'll get no help from me." Hawkins laughed, the sound like gravel grinding in a dry riverbed. "I'm not here for your help, Sheriff," he said with a sly grin. "I'm here for the preacher. And if he's got any sense left in that broken body of his, he'll turn himself over before things get ugly." The sheriff didn't respond immediately. He didn't know what he could say. Hawkins wasn't one to negotiate. Without another word, the gang leader gave a sharp nod, and his men dismounted, their eyes now scanning the town like wolves circling prey. They weren't here to make a deal. They were here to hunt. The townspeople had gathered by their windows and doors, peering nervously at the scene unfolding in front of them. Some were afraid. Others were too numb to care. But one thing was certain. They were all watching the inevitable showdown between the outlaws and the preacher. And then there was Carter. The preacher had been inside the church when Hawkins and his men arrived, but he had heard the commotion. He had heard the voices, loud, hostile, and unmistakable. He didn't need to look out the window to know what was happening. Hawkins had come for him, just as Carter had expected. He rose slowly from the pew where he had been sitting, the revolver at his side feeling heavier than before. His limp wasn't as pronounced today. There was no need for it to be. Carter made his way toward the door of the church, the weight of every step falling on his shoulders. He had known this moment was coming, but knowing didn't make it any easier. He stepped out onto the porch, the sun now hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the town. The outlaws were still standing by the sheriff's office, their horses restless and pawing at the dirt. "Carter," Hawkins called out, his voice carrying across the street, sharp and commanding. "I know you're in there. We're not leaving until we've got you." Carter's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, the preacher looked less like a man and more like a storm that was about to break. He had been quiet for far too long. He had been patient, waiting for this moment to arrive. But the time for silence was over. He turned toward the sheriff, who was watching him with a mixture of fear and resignation. Jackson knew what was coming, but he wasn't about to stand in the way. Carter had already made his choice. "I'll take care of this, Sheriff," Carter said quietly, his voice steady. "But you may want to get somewhere safe." The sheriff nodded, taking a step back as Carter made his way toward the outlaws. The gang was waiting for him, their hands twitching near their holsters, ready for the first sign of a fight. Hawkins stood at the front, his expression cold, but there was something else there. Something Carter knew well. It was fear. Hawkins wasn't sure if he could defeat the preacher, and that, in itself, was a victory. "You came looking for a fight, Hawkins," Carter said, his voice strong. But there was no anger behind it, only the grim realization of what was about to come. "And now you've found it." Hawkins chuckled, the sound dark and low. "We'll see about that, preacher. We'll see if you're still as fast as they say." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The wind died down, and the town fell eerily silent. Hawkins and his men shifted, their hands still near their weapons, but they were no longer sure of themselves. Carter could feel the change in the air. The time for words was over. Carter's hand slid slowly to the grip of his revolver, and in that moment, Crossbones Ridge knew that it was about to witness the final confrontation between Silver Bullet Sam and the outlaws who had come to claim the town. The silence in Crossbones Ridge was suffocating. The only sounds that filled the air were the soft rustle of dry desert wind and the distant creak of the old wooden buildings. The street between the church and the sheriff's office was wide, barren, and filled with tension, too thick to cut with even the sharpest blade. Carter stood in the middle of the street, his gaze locked on Hawkins and his gang. Hawkins was no stranger to violence. In fact, he had built his empire on it. But now, facing Carter, there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. It was the kind of hesitation you saw in a man who knew he might have bitten off more than he could chew. Hawkins cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. "You don't have to do this, Carter," he said, though there was no conviction in his voice. He stepped forward, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. "We don't want any trouble. Just give up, and we'll make it easy on you. Hell, we'll even let you walk out of here alive." Carter didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He simply stood there, his hand hovering near his gun, his posture relaxed but controlled. He knew better than to let his guard down. He knew Hawkins wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger the moment he thought Carter was distracted. "You can't talk your way out of this," "Hawkins," Carter said, his voice cold but even. "You came here for me. You'll get me. But not the way you want." The sun hung low in the sky, its light turning the streets orange, the air thick with heat and dust. Carter's hand moved imperceptibly closer to the revolver at his hip. He didn't need to rush. The draw was everything, and in this moment, he could feel the slow, familiar pulse of the past flowing through him. The years of gunfights, of living by the draw, those days hadn't gone anywhere. They were as much a part of him now as the air he breathed. Hawkins' men were shifting nervously behind him. One of them, a wiry fellow with a thin mustache, had already begun to edge his hand toward his holstered pistol. Carter's eyes snapped to the man's movement. In the next instant, Hawkins noticed it too. "Don't be stupid," Hawkins growled, his voice tense. "I said we don't want trouble. Stand down." The man with the mustache hesitated, his fingers still twitching toward his weapon. But it was too late. The tension had already snapped. The moment the first gun was drawn, there would be no going back. Carter saw it in their eyes, the fear. They were starting to realize what they were up against. Hawkins was the first to make a move, his hand darting to his holster. His eyes were cold, but there was a tremor in his fingers. He knew that even if he got the first shot, it might not be enough. But there was no turning back now. The world slowed to a crawl. Carter's fingers danced over the revolver's grip, his body instinctively responding to the years of training. His thumb flicked the safety off as Hawkins' hand touched his gun, but Carter was already moving, faster than the man could even draw. The crack of gunfire filled the street. Hawkins' revolver exploded from his hand, the shot ringing out in a sharp, explosive bark. Hawkins howled in pain, stumbling backward as the bullet tore through his palm. His gun fell to the ground, useless. The gang members flinched, instinctively reaching for their own weapons. But Carter was already a step ahead. He spun, his revolver rising in a fluid motion that seemed to defy time itself. A second shot rang out, and the man with the mustache crumpled to the ground, his hand clutching his side as blood pooled beneath him. He never had a chance to pull the trigger. In the span of 2 seconds, the street had gone from quiet tension to a battlefield. Carter's eyes were sharp, scanning for the next move, but his movements were still calm, calculated. The world around him felt like it was in slow motion, every detail standing out in stark clarity. The sound of the gunshot reverberating in his ears, the shift of shadows as the outlaws scrambled for cover, the heat of the sun on his face, and the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. Hawkins' remaining men drew their guns, but they were already too late. Carter's next shot rang out before the outlaws could even pull their triggers. A third outlaw dropped, his body jerking back from the force of the bullet hitting his chest. He didn't even have time to scream before he hit the dirt. 2 down, 3 to go. Hawkins was still clutching his bleeding hand, his face contorted with pain and rage. His eyes darted back to Carter, and for the first time, the fear was undeniable. This wasn't a man who had come to shoot down some helpless preacher. This was a man who had stepped into a fight he couldn't win. Carter's revolver never wavered, and he didn't give Hawkins a chance to regroup. The preacher's eyes were fixed on the remaining men, their faces pale with fear. One of them, the biggest of the group, was still holding his ground, gun drawn. He fired off a wild shot, but it missed by several feet. Carter moved before the shot even landed. The preacher's hand was steady, his aim precise. The fourth outlaw collapsed with a bullet in his chest before he could even cock his gun. The fifth and final man hesitated, eyes darting between Carter and his fallen companions. His hand hovered over his holster, but Carter's revolver was already trained on him, unwavering, relentless. The outlaw swallowed hard, his breath quickening. His gaze flickered to Hawkins, who was on the ground, his hand still clutching his bleeding palm. The gang leader was finished, but this last man wasn't sure if he wanted to join him. "Last chance," Carter said, his voice quiet, almost sympathetic. "You can walk away." The outlaw stood frozen for a moment, and Carter's eyes didn't leave him. He knew that fear was the deciding factor now. Fear of death. Fear of facing the preacher who had wiped out men twice as dangerous as him. Slowly, the outlaw dropped his gun to the dirt, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Good choice," Carter muttered. And just like that, the street was silent once more. Hawkins and his gang, the men who had terrorized Crossbones Ridge, were no more. The preacher had done what had to be done, and for the first time in years, Silver Bullet Sam felt the weight of the past settle behind him. As Carter holstered his gun, he turned toward the sheriff, who had watched everything unfold from the safety of his office. Jackson didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The sheriff had seen enough. Carter didn't bother with a farewell. He turned and made his way back to the church. The wind had died down, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, Crossbones Ridge was left in the quiet calm that followed the storm. But Carter knew better than to think it was over. The West had a way of bringing back the ghosts of the past, and for all his victories, Silver Bullet Sam had learned that the price of peace was always higher than you could ever imagine. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over Crossbones Ridge. The silence was profound, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the silence of something broken, something torn and bloodied. The streets, once filled with the sound of footsteps and whispers, were now empty, the weight of the violence that had just unfolded lingering in the air like smoke. Reverend Samuel Carter, his revolver still warm from the final shot, walked back toward the church. His gait was slow, his limp more pronounced now than it had been before. The weight of his actions pressed on him, but he wasn't burdened by it. He had done what needed to be done. The town was safe, for now. But as Carter approached the church, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't the first time he had felt this way, and it wouldn't be the last. In the West, you never knew who might be lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. He turned the corner of the church, and that's when he saw her. Clara. Clara stood at the door of the church, her back to him, her silhouette framed by the dimming light of the evening. She was tall, with long dark hair that had been pulled back in a simple braid, and her worn dress fluttered gently in the evening breeze. Her face, though weathered by time and hardship, still held a quiet strength, an echo of the woman she once was before the world had broken her. Clara had been the only one who truly understood Carter. No, Silver Bullet Sam, for who he really was. She had seen his demons, his past, and had somehow managed to love him despite it all. But she hadn't seen him in years. Not since he had left the life of a gunslinger behind and donned the mantle of a preacher. The town didn't know the real story, didn't know what Carter had done, what he had been. When Clara turned to face him, her eyes softened, but there was a flicker of sadness in them. She had heard the gunfire, had felt the tremor that had shaken the very ground beneath her feet. She knew what Carter had done. She knew what he was capable of. "You're back," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Carter stopped a few paces away, his eyes studying her face, searching for something he hadn't seen in a long time. Hope, maybe, or maybe peace. But it wasn't there, not yet. "I never left," he said quietly, his voice rough from the weight of the past. "Not really." Clara's lips pressed into a tight line. She knew the truth. She had always known it. There was no escaping the man Carter had been, no matter how much he tried to bury it beneath the preacher's robes. There was a darkness inside him that couldn't be outrun, and she had seen it firsthand. "I heard the shots," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "And I saw the men ride off. Are they all dead?" Carter didn't answer immediately. His gaze dropped to the ground, to the dust beneath his boots. He could feel the weight of her question, the burden of it. He had killed men, yes. He had killed for survival, for vengeance, for a purpose. But killing was never easy. It never would be. "They won't be bothering us again," Carter said at last, his voice distant, hollow. "They came looking for me, and they found what they were looking for." Clara took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his face. "You don't have to do this, Sam," she said, her voice pleading. "You don't have to be this man anymore." Carter looked up at her then, his eyes hard, but there was something vulnerable in them too. Something that reminded Clara of the man he had once been. The man who had loved her. The man who had dreamed of a life beyond the gunfights, beyond the bloodshed. "I can't just walk away, Clara," he said, his voice rough, like it had been dragged across gravel. "Not when the world's full of men like Hawkins. Not when people like this town need someone to stand up to them. I know, Sam. But there's more to life than just killing, Clara whispered, stepping closer. You can't keep running from yourself. You can't outrun your past. Carter's jaw tightened. He knew she was right, but the past wasn't something you could bury forever. It was a part of him, and no matter how hard he tried to move forward, it would always be there, just beneath the surface, waiting to resurface when he least expected it. I've tried, he said softly, his eyes closing as he inhaled a deep, shaky breath. I've tried, Clara, but it's who I am. It's who I'll always be. Clara reached out and placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. You don't have to be this man anymore, Sam. You're not alone. You don't have to carry all this by yourself. For a long moment, Carter stood still, his eyes closing as he allowed her words to wash over him. The weight of everything he had done, everything he had become, felt like it might crush him. But in Clara's touch, he felt a flicker of hope, a flicker that he hadn't felt in years. I don't know if I can stop, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Not when there's so much left to do. Clara's fingers tightened around his arm, her grip strong despite her gentle nature. You don't have to stop everything, Sam, but you have to stop running. You have to stop fighting every battle alone. You can have peace. You deserve peace. Carter's eyes flicked open, meeting hers. For the first time in years, he saw something that he hadn't allowed himself to see: hope, a real chance at redemption. I don't know how, he admitted, his voice rough. But maybe I can try. Clara nodded slowly, the sadness still lingering in her eyes. But now there was something else, something like understanding, like acceptance. She knew that Carter wasn't perfect. She knew that the road ahead would be hard. But maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. The preacher and the gunslinger. The man who had loved and lost, and the woman who had never stopped loving him. Together, maybe they could find a way to lay down the past. For now, it was enough. I'll help you, Clara said softly, but only if you let me. Carter didn't answer immediately. He didn't know if he was ready to let go of the man he had been, the man who had lived by the gun. But for the first time in a long time, he realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to try. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the town, Carter and Clara stood there, side by side, facing the unknown. Together. The days that followed were filled with a strange kind of quiet. Crossbones Ridge, once a town suffocating beneath the rule of the outlaws, now felt strangely still. The violent gunfights and the whispers of terror had faded into the dusty corners of memory, replaced by something that felt unfamiliar. Reverend Samuel Carter, the preacher who had once been known as Silver Bullet Sam, now spent his days doing what he had always done, preaching to the small congregation of souls that still called Crossbones Ridge home. But there was something different now. There was peace in his heart, a peace that hadn't been there before. Clara's presence, the steady reminder of the man he had once been, had begun to heal the wounds he had carried for so long. The days of hiding behind the pulpit, pretending that he could outrun the man he had been, were coming to an end. The town, however, wasn't yet ready to accept the change. The townsfolk had seen what Carter was capable of, had seen the gunfighter in his eyes. Some still looked at him with fear, others with awe. But there were fewer whispers behind closed doors, fewer sideways glances when he passed by. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One morning, as Carter prepared for his usual sermon, Clara entered the church, a soft smile playing on her lips. She had become a quiet presence in the town, a woman who brought calm to even the stormiest souls. The church was a sanctuary for her too, a place where they could meet in peace. "Are you ready for today?" Clara asked, her voice gentle, but with the quiet strength she had always possessed. Her presence, though soft and comforting, had become a source of stability in Carter's life, a steadying hand on the shoulder of a man who had spent too long alone. Carter looked up from his desk, where he had been reading over the sermon notes he had written the night before. His hand hovered over the paper, and he let out a long sigh. "I don't know, Clara. Every time I step in front of the congregation, I wonder if they're still seeing the preacher or if they're seeing the gunslinger," he said, his voice low, as if the words themselves might betray him. Clara moved to his side, her hand brushing over his shoulder, a touch that both comforted and grounded him. "It doesn't matter what they see, Sam. What matters is what you see in yourself. And I know you've been seeing the right man." Carter's gaze softened, and he nodded slowly. "I've been running from that man for so long, Clara. I don't know if I'm ready to accept who I really am. Not after everything I've done." "I know," she said softly, her voice full of understanding, "but you can't outrun it anymore. You fought your battles, Sam. Now you have to decide who you want to be." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that allowed room for reflection, for understanding, for change. Carter knew what Clara meant. He had been running from the man he had been for far too long, but the truth was that he couldn't escape his past. Not entirely. He could only move forward, step by painful step, with the knowledge that his past didn't have to define his future. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring," Carter said, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "But I think I'm ready to try." Clara smiled, a warmth in her eyes that made Carter's heart swell with a quiet hope. "That's all anyone can do," she replied. And so, together, they walked to the front of the church, side by side. The doors creaked open, and Carter stepped onto the pulpit, his heart steady for the first time in years. The townsfolk trickled in, taking their seats, and the usual murmurs quieted as Carter began. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about the past. He wasn't thinking about Silver Bullet Sam. He wasn't thinking about the gang he had wiped out or the bloodshed that had followed him across the West. He was thinking about the present, the people in front of him, the life he was building with Clara, the peace he was slowly learning to accept. The words that flowed from his mouth were simple, but they felt true. They weren't filled with grand promises or fiery speeches. They were the words of a man who had lived through hell and had come out the other side, scarred but still standing. "Today, I'm going to talk about forgiveness," Carter began, his voice carrying through the church, steady and calm. "Not just the forgiveness we ask for, but the forgiveness we give to ourselves. Because we all carry burdens of guilt, of shame, of things we can never undo. But we can choose to forgive ourselves, to move forward. That's the only way we can heal. And healing isn't something that happens overnight. It's something we work at, every day." The congregation was silent as they listened, their eyes fixed on the preacher in front of them. Some had heard the rumors of his past. Some still wondered if he was the same man who had taken down the Thunderclaps. But today, none of that mattered. Today, they heard a man who had found peace. They heard a man who had learned to forgive himself. And as the sermon ended, Carter felt something that he hadn't felt in years: peace. For the first time, the church didn't feel like a prison. It didn't feel like a place to hide. It felt like home. As the townsfolk filed out, Clara stayed behind, waiting for him at the back of the church. When Carter approached, she smiled, her eyes full of pride. "You did good," she said, her voice soft. Carter nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I think I'm finally starting to believe that." But even as the church doors closed and the sun sank lower in the sky, Carter knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would always be a shadow behind him, a part of him that could never be erased. But for the first time, he didn't fear it. He had found something more important than redemption. He had found acceptance. The following weeks in Crossbones Ridge were peaceful. The outlaws that had once held the town in a vice grip had fled, leaving only whispers in their wake. Carter's days as a preacher were spent much like any other preacher's might be, leading his small congregation, offering counsel, and mending the broken spirits of those who came seeking solace. And yet, there were still times when he would find himself standing in the pulpit, looking out at his flock, and wondering if they saw him as something other than the preacher. Clara remained by his side, offering support in ways that were both tangible and quiet, her presence a constant reminder that there was still hope, still love, even for someone like him. There were moments, brief but sharp, when Carter would feel the pull of his past, the distant, gnawing ache of the gunfighter he had once been. But each time, Clara was there, a steady anchor that kept him grounded. Yet, peace was fragile in the West. Carter knew this better than anyone. The past had a way of resurfacing when you least expected it, and while he had chosen a new path, there were forces beyond his control that were determined to drag him back into the darkness he had left behind. It was late one afternoon when the first sign of trouble arrived. Carter had just finished a late lunch in the small house attached to the church. He had been sitting at the window, staring out across the dusty streets, when a figure appeared at the edge of town. The figure was a rider, tall and broad-shouldered, his silhouette casting a long shadow as he rode into the fading sunlight. Carter didn't recognize him at first, but something in the man's gait, the way he sat atop his horse with a purposeful, deliberate motion, struck a chord deep in Carter's gut. This man wasn't just passing through. He was here for a reason. Clara entered the room as Carter rose from his seat, his mind already working. "Who's that?" she asked, her eyes following his gaze out the window. Carter didn't respond immediately. He knew that look, the look of someone who carried the weight of the past with them, someone who had seen too much and survived by whatever means necessary. He knew what it meant when a man like that came to town. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice low, "but I have a feeling we're about to find out." Clara's hand instinctively moved to his arm, the concern in her eyes evident. "Sam, do you think it's from your past?" Carter glanced at her, his jaw tightening. He didn't want to say it, didn't want to admit that his past had come back to claim him, but he knew better. The West had a way of pulling people back into the fold, no matter how hard they tried to escape. "I don't know yet," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper, "but I think I need to go talk to him." Without another word, Carter walked toward the door, his coat billowing behind him. Clara watched him go, her heart heavy with an unspoken fear. She knew that this was only the beginning. She had seen the change in him, the peace he had fought so hard for. But she also knew that peace could be fleeting, especially in a town like Crossbones Ridge. As Carter stepped out into the street, he felt the weight of the moment settle over him. The air was thick with the scent of dust and dry earth, the sun casting long shadows as the rider approached the center of town. Carter stood still, watching him, the old, familiar feeling stirring in his chest. The man stopped his horse a few paces away, his eyes locking with Carter's. "You're him," the rider said, his voice gruff but steady. "Silver Bullet Sam." Carter didn't flinch. He didn't acknowledge the title, didn't give the man the satisfaction. It was a name he had left behind, a name that had brought him nothing but bloodshed and regret. "That's who I used to be," Carter said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "I'm just Reverend Samuel Carter now." The rider snorted, clearly unimpressed. He dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. The man was tall, rugged, and weathered by the unforgiving life he had lived, but there was something in his eyes, a sharp, calculating look that told Carter this wasn't just some stranger passing through. This was someone who knew who Carter was, and who probably had a reason to come looking for him. "You've been living a quiet life, haven't you, preacher?" the man said, his voice edged with a sneer. "But you can't run from who you really are." Carter's eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" The man's grin widened, revealing yellowed teeth. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, holding it out toward Carter. "I'm not here to make trouble," the rider said, "but you might want to take a look at this." Carter hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking from the man's face to the paper in his hand. Slowly, he stepped forward and took it, unfolding it carefully. As he scanned the paper, his jaw clenched. It was a wanted poster. The reward was substantial, enough to make any man's eyes widen. And the name on the poster was his. Not Silver Bullet Sam, but Sam Carter. There were no details about the crimes he had committed, no specific charges, just a large sum of money for his capture. "I don't run anymore," Carter said, his voice hard. "And I'm not interested in whatever it is you're offering." The rider's grin only grew wider. "It's not about what I'm offering, preacher. It's about what they're offering. And it looks like you've got some unfinished business." Carter's eyes flashed with realization. He had always known that the past had a way of catching up with him. But now, it seemed the past was here to collect. "I'm done with that life," Carter said firmly, his voice steady. And if you're here looking for a fight, you're going to be sorely disappointed." The rider shrugged, not at all fazed by Carter's words. "I don't need to fight you, Sam. I just need you to remember who you really are. You can't run from it forever." Without another word, the man turned and mounted his horse, his gaze lingering on Carter for a moment longer before he nudged the horse into motion. As the rider rode off into the distance, Carter felt the familiar knot tighten in his chest. The past was never really gone, was it? Carter stood there for a long moment, the weight of the wanted poster heavy in his hand. The quiet had been shattered. The peace he had fought for was slipping through his fingers, and the call of his past had returned. But this time, Carter wouldn't run. This time, he would face it head-on. The air in Crossbones Ridge seemed to have thickened after the rider's visit. For a few moments, Carter stood frozen in the street, the wanted poster crumpled in his hand. His mind raced, piecing together the meaning of the rider's words. This wasn't just some bounty hunter looking for a quick payday. This was a messenger, a harbinger from his past, coming to collect what Carter had tried to leave behind. Clara had stepped outside, drawn by the weight of the silence that now hung over the town. She saw Carter standing there, the look on his face unreadable. Her heart tightened at the sight of him, knowing that something had shifted, something had come crashing back into their lives. "Sam?" Clara's voice was soft, but there was an unmistakable edge of concern to it. She approached him slowly, her gaze flickering down to the crumpled poster in his hand. Carter's eyes met hers, but his expression remained distant, lost in thought. "It's from my past," he said, his voice low and resigned. "I thought I could bury it. I thought I could build something new here. But it doesn't matter how far I run. It always catches up." Clara stepped closer, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "You don't have to do this, Sam. You've changed. You don't need to go back to the man you were." He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions. There was pain in them. Regret, yes, but something else too. Something deeper, something that whispered of unfinished business, a part of him that could never be put to rest. "I don't have a choice," he said quietly. "I don't have any choice but to face it. There's no running from this. Not anymore." The wind picked up as if it too had sensed the change in the air. The streets of Crossbones Ridge had quieted, the usual bustle of the town now replaced by the distant sound of horses' hooves, hooves that were coming closer and fast. Clara's gaze turned towards the horizon, her eyes narrowing as the sound grew louder. She had been in this town long enough to know when trouble was on its way. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice tense. Carter didn't answer. He didn't need to. He could already feel it. The same feeling he'd had all those years ago. The unmistakable awareness that something dangerous was about to unfold, and that this time, it wasn't just him in the line of fire. It was the whole town. As the riders entered the town, their figures slowly materializing from the dust, Carter recognized the leader immediately. It was Jesse Crowley, a name that Carter had hoped to forget. Crowley had been a part of the Thunderclaps, one of the last surviving members of the gang that Carter had wiped out years ago. He had disappeared for a long while, but now he was back, and it was clear that he hadn't come to make amends. The riders' eyes locked with Carter's as they approached, and a cold smile spread across Crowley's face. It was a smile that spoke of revenge, a smile that spoke of a score yet to be settled. "You really thought you could leave all that behind, didn't you, Carter?" Crowley's voice was deep, his words laced with menace. "You think you can just preach your way through life now? You can't outrun your past, preacher." Carter stood firm, his hand instinctively resting near the handle of his revolver, though he had no intention of drawing it just yet. He didn't know how many men Crowley had with him, but he knew that a fight was coming. It always came when Crowley was involved. "I'm not the man I was," Carter said calmly, his voice carrying a quiet defiance. "And I won't be the man you want me to be." Crowley chuckled darkly, dismounting with a smooth, practiced movement. He was tall, lean, and weathered by years of violence. His eyes were hard, a reflection of the life he had chosen. "The past doesn't change, Carter. You can cover it up with all the prayers and sermons you want, but I know who you are, and I know who you'll always be." Carter's hand tightened around the revolver, but he didn't draw it yet. He wasn't afraid of Crowley. He had faced worse men, men who had terrorized entire towns. But the problem was, Crowley wasn't here just for Carter. He was here for the whole town. "You don't want to do this," Carter said, his voice low but steady. "You've seen what happens when men like you come looking for trouble. You don't want any part of that." Crowley's smile never faltered. "You think I'm scared of you, preacher? You think I haven't seen what you can do? Well, maybe I'm not here to kill you, Carter. Maybe I'm here to make sure you remember who you really are." As the words left Crowley's mouth, Carter's mind raced. He knew this game. He knew how it worked. Crowley was trying to provoke him, trying to get him to pull the trigger so that he could justify whatever he planned next. But Carter wasn't going to fall for it. He was done with that life. He had moved on, and no matter what Crowley said, he wasn't going to be drawn back into the chaos. Crowley, however, wasn't done. His eyes flickered over Carter's shoulder, and for just a moment, Carter felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. A second group of riders appeared, this time from the opposite direction. They were mounted high, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, their eyes scanning the town with a sharpness that made Carter's stomach turn. These weren't just regular outlaws. These were bounty hunters, the kind who didn't care about anything but the money they could make from bringing someone like Carter in. And there were a lot of them. Carter's hand moved to his gun, his fingers brushing the worn grip. He could feel the weight of it, the familiar rush of adrenaline as his body fell into the old rhythm. But as his eyes scanned the growing crowd of men, he realized something. This wasn't just a fight for his own survival anymore. This was a fight for Crossbones Ridge, and it was one that Carter wasn't going to lose. The heat of the afternoon sun bore down on Crossbones Ridge, casting long shadows over the dusty streets. The quiet had been shattered by the arrival of Jesse Crowley and his crew, but it wasn't just them. No, the riders that had appeared from the other direction, the bounty hunters, made it clear that this wasn't just a confrontation between Carter and a few men from his past. It was the beginning of something bigger, something darker. Carter stood in the middle of the street, his mind racing, his heart pounding. The gunfighters, the outlaws, and now the bounty hunters. His past was coming for him all at once, as if it had finally decided that it was time to collect. It was a fight he hadn't wanted, not after everything he had done to build a new life here. But it was a fight he would have to take, because he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the town of Crossbones Ridge. Clara was standing behind him, her hand pressed against the doorframe of the church, her expression a mixture of fear and concern. She had seen Carter face down men before, but never like this. Never so many, never so determined. Her heart clenched in her chest as she saw the weight of the moment settle over him. The man she loved was no longer just a preacher. He was a man who had fought and killed for survival, and that part of him was coming back now, whether he liked it or not. "I need you to stay inside, Clara," Carter said quietly, not looking back at her. His voice was steady, but there was an underlying tension there, a warning. Clara shook her head, stepping forward. "I'm not going to hide, Sam. I won't stand by while you face this alone." Carter didn't answer. He couldn't. He knew there was no point in arguing with her. Clara had always been strong, always ready to fight beside him when the world seemed like it was going to swallow them both. But this time was different. He knew what was coming, and he didn't want her caught in the crossfire. He turned his attention back to the street, his hand never straying far from the revolver at his side. Crowley was still standing there, his grin widening as he saw the fear ripple through the townsfolk. The bounty hunters had started to dismount, spreading out to take positions, their eyes scanning the town, sizing up every potential escape route. Carter's mind raced, calculating the odds. The bounty hunters were skilled, experienced men who knew how to track down and capture their prey. But they didn't know Crossbones Ridge like he did. They didn't know the narrow alleyways, the rooftops, the places where a man could hide just long enough to strike. It was time. Carter's hand moved swiftly, his fingers wrapping around the grip of his revolver. He could hear Crowley's voice in the back of his mind, mocking him, pushing him to act. "You can't run, Carter. Not from me. Not from them." But Carter wasn't running. He wasn't going to make that mistake again. He pulled the revolver from its holster, the cold steel of the weapon familiar in his hand. His fingers tightened around the grip, and for a moment, everything slowed. The faces of the bounty hunters blurred in his mind, replaced by memories of past gunfights. Memories of a time when he had been forced to draw his gun out of necessity, when he had killed without hesitation. But those days were over, or so he had thought. Now, they were back. "You don't want to do this, Crowley," Carter said, his voice cutting through the silence, his gaze locked on the man. "Leave now, and I won't kill you." Crowley's smile faltered for a split second, and that was all Carter needed. He moved, the revolver a blur in his hand, and before Crowley could react, the first shot rang out. The leader of the Outlaws collapsed, his gun slipping from his hand as he hit the dirt. His men froze, some of them looking at him in disbelief, others looking at Carter with a mix of fear and uncertainty. But they hadn't come this far to turn back. They had their orders, and they knew what was at stake. Carter didn't pause. He spun, his eyes scanning the area, calculating, reacting faster than any of the men who had come for him. The bounty hunters were already moving into position, taking cover behind the nearest buildings. But Carter knew the streets of Crossbones Ridge like the back of his hand. He shot first, his aim true, taking down the nearest bounty hunter before the man could even pull his gun. The shot rang out, deafening in the open air, but Carter didn't flinch. He wasn't about to give them any time to react. The remaining outlaws opened fire, but Carter was faster. He ducked behind a wooden cart, using it for cover, his heart pounding as the bullets flew past him. He could hear the sound of hooves as the other outlaws tried to circle around him, but Carter was already on the move, running across the street and taking cover behind the old mill. He could hear the shouts and gunfire, the sound of men scrambling to stay alive, and the unmistakable sound of boots on the dirt as the bounty hunters closed in. He had to act quickly. He couldn't let them get the upper hand. Carter's mind raced as he scanned the battlefield. He could hear Clara's voice in his head, urging him to stay safe, to get out of there before it was too late. But it was already too late. This was his fight now. This was the price of peace. The town of Crossbones Ridge was caught in the middle, the people hiding in their homes, praying for the chaos to end. Carter didn't know how long he had before the tide turned in favor of the outlaws and bounty hunters, but he knew he couldn't let that happen. He stood up from his cover, his revolver raised high, and with one fluid motion, he fired another round. The shot found its mark, and one of the bounty hunters crumpled to the ground. The remaining men hesitated, and in that brief moment, Carter moved again, faster than they could track. He leapt behind a nearby stack of crates, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but his focus unwavering. It was a dangerous game, one that only the brave or the foolhardy would play. But Carter had lived through worse. He had stared death in the face before, and he wasn't going to let it win now. As the fight continued, Carter's thoughts flickered to Clara. She was still inside the church, still safe, for now. But he knew that the longer this battle went on, the more likely it was that the outlaws would turn their attention to her, to the people of the town. He had to finish this, and he had to finish it quickly. The final moments of the battle unfolded in a blur of gunfire and dust. Carter moved with the precision of a man who had fought through hell and come back alive. He didn't hesitate. He didn't falter. He just kept moving, kept shooting, until finally, the last of the bounty hunters lay sprawled in the dirt. The street was silent once more, the only sound the distant wind carrying the dust across the town. Carter stood there, his breath heavy, his hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline. He hadn't just fought for his life today. He had fought for Crossbones Ridge, for the peace that was worth far more than anything his past had to offer. And as he looked around at the carnage, the dead men at his feet, Carter knew that no matter how hard he tried to escape it, the past would always be a part of him. But he also knew that he could choose to fight for something better. He turned toward the church, his gaze softening when he saw Clara standing in the doorway, watching him with wide eyes. She was waiting for him, and for the first time in years, Carter knew exactly where he belonged. The sun was low on the horizon, casting a soft orange hue over Crossbones Ridge. The dust in the streets was still settling, the smoke from gunfire hanging in the air like a stubborn fog. The battle was over, at least for now, and the town was eerily quiet. The sounds of the last gunshots had barely faded when Carter turned and made his way toward the church. The street had been cleared, but the aftermath was all around him. Bodies of bounty hunters and outlaws lay scattered, each a grim reminder of the past that Carter had tried to leave behind. The weight of each life lost pressed down on him, but there was little time to reflect on it. The town was still vulnerable. Carter's mind was already working, calculating the next move, the next threat. It wasn't just Crowley who had come to Crossbones Ridge. There were others out there, men and women whose names Carter didn't even know, but who would be looking to claim the bounty that had been placed on his head. As he walked toward the church, Carter's hand instinctively gripped his revolver. He could hear the creaking of the old wooden doors before they opened, and there she was, Clara. She was standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable as her eyes scanned the street behind him, taking in the aftermath of the chaos. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. But there was strength in her eyes, strength that Carter had come to rely on more than once. She had seen him fight before, but this time, something had changed. The quiet strength she had always carried was now wrapped in something deeper, something Carter knew all too well. "It's over. For now," Carter said, his voice rough from the exertion of the battle. He didn't know what had come over him during the fight, but he had felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The gunfire, the bloodshed. It was all a part of him, a part he couldn't escape. He had fought for the town, yes, but he had also fought because it was what he knew, what he had been trained to do. Clara's eyes softened as she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She could see the exhaustion in his face, the toll that the violence had taken. But she also saw something else, something Carter had hidden for so long. Guilt, regret. "You're not alone, Sam," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper as she reached out to touch his arm. "You don't have to carry this weight by yourself." For a moment, Carter's breath caught in his chest. He had spent so long running from his past, trying to bury the man he had been, that he hadn't allowed himself to accept the people who cared about him. But here she was, standing in front of him, offering him something he hadn't known he needed. Peace. Acceptance. "I know," he said quietly, "but I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to leave it behind. Every time I think I've found a way out, it pulls me back in." Clara's gaze never wavered. "You're not the man you used to be, Sam, and you don't have to go through this alone. Not anymore." Carter looked down at his hands, the weight of the revolver still heavy against his side. He didn't know if he could ever truly be free of the man he had once been. But Clara was right. He didn't have to face it alone. "Maybe I've been running from the wrong things," he said, his voice quiet, the words heavy with the weight of everything he had lived through. Clara smiled softly, a quiet understanding in her eyes. "You don't have to run anymore, Sam. You've already fought the hardest battle. Now, it's time to fight for something else, for us, for the town." Carter's gaze lifted to meet hers, and for the first time, he felt something like hope stir inside him. It wasn't the kind of hope he had felt when he was younger, the naive hope of a man who thought he could change the world. It was quieter, more subdued. A hope that came from knowing that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for redemption. As they stood there in the doorway, a faint noise reached Carter's ears. Hooves. And then, the unmistakable sound of horses galloping in the distance. He could feel the tension rise in his chest again as his eyes scanned the horizon, watching for the first sign of movement. Clara must have noticed it too, because she stepped closer to him, her eyes searching his face. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "They're not done," Carter said, his voice hardening with resolve. "The bounty hunters, the ones who want me dead, they'll be back. They always come back." Clara's hand tightened around his arm, a silent plea in her eyes. But Carter had already made up his mind. The town was still vulnerable, and while he had fought once, he knew that the fight was far from over. "I'll do whatever I can to protect this town, Clara," Carter said, his voice steady and determined. "I won't let them take it from us." She nodded, her expression resolute. She had seen what Carter could do when he was pushed to the brink. And this time, he wasn't just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for the people of Crossbones Ridge, for the life he had built with Clara, for the peace that had taken root, no matter how fragile it seemed. "I'm with you," Clara said quietly, her eyes meeting his. "We'll face it together." As Carter looked around at the town, the people who had stayed behind, the ones who still believed that Crossbones Ridge could be something better, he knew that this was a fight worth fighting. He didn't know how many more battles would come, how many more men would show up, guns drawn, looking to take what they couldn't have. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to run anymore. The past had come back for him, but this time, he wasn't alone. And no matter what came next, Carter would face it head-on. And he would do it for Crossbones Ridge. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the town in a deep twilight. The street was still, but the air felt thick with anticipation, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Carter stood at the entrance of the church, Clara by his side, both of them staring toward the edge of town. The distant sound of galloping hooves had now become clearer, and with each passing second, the noise grew louder. It was only a matter of time before they arrived. Carter's eyes were sharp, his mind already working through the possibilities. There were more bounty hunters out there. He could feel it. The town might be small, but it was no longer the quiet, forgotten place it had once been. Crossbones Ridge had become a battleground, and the stakes were higher than ever. He turned to Clara, his expression hardening. "Stay inside," he said, his voice quieter than before, but firm. "This won't be over until they're all gone." Clara nodded, her face determined. "I'm not afraid, Sam, but I know you need to focus." Carter met her gaze, and for a brief moment, the weight of everything he had been, everything he had done, hung between them. But Clara didn't see him as the gunfighter anymore. She saw him as the man who had chosen to stay, the man who had fought for something better than the violence that had once consumed him. That was enough. "I'll be back soon," he said, his voice softer now. "I promise." As Clara disappeared inside the church, Carter stepped into the street, his boots crunching softly on the dirt. The town had grown quieter in the past few hours, as if everyone had instinctively known that something was coming. But now, with the sound of hooves growing ever closer, the silence was broken by the steady rhythm of fate, and Carter knew that this time, there would be no avoiding the inevitable. He moved with purpose, his revolver close at hand, the weight of it comforting. His body was tired from the previous battle, but his mind was sharp, his focus unwavering. He didn't know how many men were coming, but he knew they would come in full force. Crowley hadn't been alone, and the bounty hunters, though fewer in number, were no less determined to bring him down. The sound of hooves grew louder, closer. Carter didn't hesitate as he made his way toward the center of town, just outside the saloon. The dust kicked up beneath the horses' hooves, and as they crested the hill, Carter saw them. A group of riders, 6 of them, each one armed and ready for a fight. At the front was a man Carter immediately recognized, though he hadn't seen him in years. Harland, another member of the Thunderclaps, a man Carter had once faced down in a standoff that had nearly cost him his life. Harland's eyes met Carter's from the saddle, and a smile stretched across his scarred face. A smile that spoke of old grudges and unfinished business. "You still breathing, Carter?" Harland called out, his voice carrying across the still air. "I gotta say, I didn't think you'd last this long." Carter didn't flinch, his eyes narrowing as he studied the group of riders. They were all tough men, men who had seen death and lived to tell about it. But they had no idea what they were up against. "I'm not here to talk, Harland," Carter replied, his voice steady. "You and your men should turn around and leave while you still can. This town's not yours for the taking." Harland laughed, the sound rough and cruel. "You think we're just gonna turn tail and run? Not when there's money to be made and a score to settle. You're worth a lot, Carter, and I intend to collect." Carter's hand rested on the revolver at his side, the familiar weight grounding him. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for Clara, for the town, for the future they had started to build. This wasn't just about the bounty. This was about sending a message. "You don't want to do this," Carter said, his voice cold as steel. "You may think you've got the upper hand, but you don't. Not here. Not now." Harland's smile faltered slightly, but the other riders were already dismounting, spreading out across the street. It was clear now that this wasn't going to be a quick exchange of words. Carter's heart beat faster, But his mind was calm, calculating. He could see the town's layout in his mind. The alleyways, the buildings, the places where he could take cover. He knew these streets like the back of his hand, and he wasn't about to let Harland or his crew turn Crossbones Ridge into their battleground. Harland's eyes flickered to his men. "You heard the man," he said, voice sharp. "Make sure he doesn't walk away from this." And with that, the first shot rang out. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed through the street, and the battle was on. Carter dropped behind a nearby cart just as a bullet slammed into the wood where he had been standing. His hand was already moving, drawing his revolver, and he returned fire almost instinctively. The bullet found its mark, striking one of Harland's men in the chest, sending him to the ground in a heap. The riders returned fire, and Carter ducked low, using the cart as cover. The sound of hooves pounded the earth as another rider came around the corner, trying to flank him. Carter fired again, the revolver's shot ringing out in a deadly arc. Another rider fell. The fight was fast, furious, and brutal. Carter was quicker than his opponents, using his knowledge of the town's layout to his advantage. He moved between buildings, taking shots from hidden spots, making it difficult for Harland and his men to pin him down. But there were still 4 men left. 4 men who had come to kill him, and they wouldn't stop until they had him. Carter's breath came heavy, and he could feel the exhaustion from the previous battle start to take its toll. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. The people of Crossbones Ridge needed him to finish this. The last of the outlaws, a lanky man with a grim expression, came charging toward Carter, gun drawn, ready to make his move. But Carter was faster. He stepped out from behind the building, his revolver raised, and with one quick shot, the man dropped from his horse, his gun falling to the dirt. Carter scanned the street, his heart pounding. Harland was the only one left. The 2 men locked eyes from across the street. Harland had been waiting for this moment, and Carter could see the desperation in his eyes. Harland had underestimated him. They all had. Without a word, Harland lunged for his gun. But Carter's hand was already moving, his finger pulling the trigger in a fluid motion. The shot was true. Harland's body jerked back, and he crumpled to the ground, his gun falling from his hand. The street was silent once more, the dust settling around Carter as he lowered his revolver, his chest heaving with the effort. He had won again. But at what cost? Crossbones Ridge was safe, for now. But the price of peace had just risen, and Carter knew that this was far from over. As he turned to face the town, he saw the people slowly emerging from their homes, their eyes filled with a mix of awe and fear. Carter knew they had seen him fight. They had seen the man he had once been, but they had also seen the man he had become. He wasn't just Silver Bullet Sam anymore. He was something else. He was their protector, and no matter what came next, he would stand his ground. The aftermath of the fight still clung to the air, thick and heavy, as the townsfolk of Crossbones Ridge began to emerge from the shelter of their homes and buildings. The streets, once littered with dust and silence, now carried the weight of both victory and loss. The bodies of Harland and his men lay sprawled across the street like discarded objects, victims of a battle that had been forced upon the town, but also a stark reminder that the peace Carter had fought for was tenuous at best. The wind kicked up once more, swirling the dust around Carter's boots as he holstered his revolver, the cold steel sliding back into place. His chest still heaved with the exertion of the fight, but his eyes, sharp and unwavering, scanned the quiet faces of the townsfolk who had witnessed everything. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The street seemed to hold its breath. Carter's mind raced. He hadn't expected it to end like this. He had hoped, prayed, that after the last battle, he could settle down, that his past could stay buried, that Crossbones Ridge could remain the peaceful sanctuary he and Clara had worked so hard to build. But now, after seeing Harland's lifeless body on the ground, he knew that peace, true peace, was as fleeting as the wind itself in a town like this. Then, from the crowd, a voice broke the silence. "Is it over?" It was Sheriff Jackson, his weathered face drawn tight with worry, his hand resting uneasily on the holster at his side. He had seen the bloodshed, had watched as Carter took down the outlaws one by one, but there was no hiding the uncertainty in his eyes now. Jackson wasn't a gunslinger. He was a lawman who had been thrown into a war he hadn't prepared for. Carter nodded, though the gesture felt hollow. "For now," he replied, his voice gruff, the weight of the battle still lingering on his tongue. "But they'll be back." "This fight isn't over." Jackson hesitated, his eyes flicking from the fallen men to Carter, then back to the rest of the townsfolk, who were beginning to gather their courage and step out into the street. He saw the fear in their eyes, the same fear Carter had once carried himself, fear that had grown into something else over the years, a kind of reluctant respect. But that fear still lingered. "You sure about that?" Jackson asked, his voice low. "Seems like you've got the upper hand now. Maybe they'll just let you go." Carter turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the distant mountains loomed like silent witnesses to everything that had happened. He didn't need to look back at Jackson to know the sheriff's doubts. He had seen them before, the same hesitation, the same doubt in every lawman's eyes when faced with the true nature of the Wild West. The law might have had a place in the town, but here, where gunslingers ruled and violence was currency, law meant very little. "No," Carter said, his voice quiet but firm. "They won't stop until I'm dead. And if they can't get me, they'll come after the town." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, and Jackson's face tightened. He knew Carter was right, but there was little he could do. The town had no real defense against the kind of men who came looking for trouble, and now that word was out that Carter was here, the storm that had been brewing on the horizon was about to break. Clara stepped out from the church, her eyes scanning the carnage around her. She had been waiting, unsure of what was to come, but she had known, in her heart, that this day would come. She had seen the man Carter was before, had seen the ghosts of his past, the toll it had taken on him. She had tried to offer him peace, but the truth was that peace had never come easily to men like him. She walked toward him, the dust swirling around her boots as the crowd parted to make way. Her gaze met his, steady and unwavering, but her voice was soft as she reached his side. "Sam," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What now?" Carter's eyes flicked over to her, his gaze softening only for a moment before he regained his composure. He could feel her presence beside him, like a tether, pulling him back from the edge of the abyss. She had always been his anchor, but he knew that this town, this life, they were no longer the sanctuary they once seemed. "We wait," he said, his voice low and steady. "We rebuild, we fortify, and we prepare." The people of Crossbones Ridge began to gather around them, their faces a mix of curiosity, fear, and hope. Carter didn't need to look at them to know what they were thinking. They had seen the fight. They had seen the outlaws fall. And now, they had to decide if they were willing to stand with him, if they were willing to take up arms and defend what little they had left. Carter's gaze swept over them. He could see the uncertainty in their eyes, the hesitation that came with the reality of living in a town like this. A town that had once been a place of forgotten dreams, but now, in the wake of his actions, had become a battleground. "Listen," Carter said, his voice loud enough to carry across the street. "I won't ask any of you to pick up a gun. I know this isn't what you came here for, but I won't let them take this town from us. Not without a fight." Clara's hand gently touched his arm, her eyes filled with silent support, but also with a quiet fear. She had never wanted this. She had never wanted the violence that came with being close to Carter. But now, as she looked around at the town, she knew that the choice wasn't really up to them anymore. They had already been drawn into the fight, and it was a fight they would have to face together. One by one, the townsfolk stepped forward. The first was Gabe, the blacksmith, a man who had always kept to himself but had shown loyalty when it counted. He looked at Carter, then nodded, a grin set to his jaw. "If you're willing to fight, preacher, then I'm with you." The others followed suit, each one stepping forward with a mix of hesitation and resolve. Carter had known they weren't soldiers, not hardened fighters, but they were willing to stand by him. They had seen the kind of man he was now, and they understood the stakes. As Carter surveyed the small group before him, a feeling of resolve settled over him. It was a strange thing, hope, mixed with the cold reality that they would need to be prepared for what was coming. "We may be outnumbered," Carter said, his voice quiet but confident, We may not have the firepower that the outlaws and bounty hunters have, but we have something they don't: the will to survive." The townsfolk nodded, some still unsure, but most with the glint of determination in their eyes. They knew they had no choice but to stand and fight, or to lose everything. In that moment, Carter realized something. This town, these people, they weren't just the remnants of a forgotten place anymore. They had become something more. They had become a community, bound by the shared struggle to protect the life they had built. And Carter wasn't about to let anyone take that away from them. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, Carter stood at the front of the group, a silent promise forming in his heart. No matter what came next, he would stand with them. He would fight for them, for Crossbones Ridge. And this time, he wasn't running. The night that followed the battle was quiet, but the calm felt deceptive. Crossbones Ridge had always been a town caught between the past and the future, but tonight, it felt like the very earth was holding its breath. The people had gathered together in the saloon, huddled in uneasy silence. They had seen the bloodshed, and while many of them had taken their stand beside Carter, none of them could shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Carter had never been one for false hope. He knew that the small victory they had achieved in the street was only temporary. Harlan's crew, the bounty hunters, and the men who were still hunting him were out there, waiting. They weren't the kind of men who took defeat lightly, and they wouldn't stay gone for long. Still, there was something different about the people who were gathered in the saloon now. There was no panic in their eyes. They weren't running anymore. Carter saw the fire in their gaze, the steely resolve that had been kindled by his own refusal to back down. And that made all the difference. Clara sat beside him at the small table, her fingers idly tracing the rim of a glass. Her face was calm, but Carter could see the worry etched deep in her features. She had never wanted any part of this life, but she had accepted it with a strength that left him in awe. She had stood beside him after every fight, every battle, and now, even though the odds were stacked against them, she was still there. "I don't know if I can do this again," Carter said quietly, his voice low enough that only Clara could hear. "I don't know if I can keep protecting everyone here. What if it's not enough?" Clara looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "You've been carrying this burden for so long, Sam, but you don't have to do it alone anymore. You've got the people here now. They've seen who you are, and they've made their choice." Her words were simple, but they resonated in Carter's chest. He had carried the weight of his past for so long, always convinced that he was the only one who could protect those he cared about. But Clara was right. He wasn't alone anymore. The town, for better or worse, had come together. They had chosen to fight. "I won't let them down," Carter said, his voice steady despite the knot of fear and uncertainty in his stomach. He looked around the saloon, taking in the faces of the townsfolk who had gathered there. They were ordinary people, farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers. But in this moment, they were more than that. They were a community bound together by their will to survive. As the evening wore on, the weight of what was to come settled over them all. They had no illusions about the battle ahead. It would be hard. It would be bloody, and not all of them would make it out alive. But they had something the outlaws and bounty hunters didn't have: a reason to fight. By morning, the streets were quiet once again. The town had been transformed, but the tension remained. People were preparing. They had reinforced the town's defenses, setting up barriers and creating makeshift barricades in key locations. Carter had spent the night organizing the townsfolk, making sure everyone knew what they needed to do when the next wave of trouble arrived. It was almost dawn when the first riders were spotted on the horizon. Carter stood on the porch of the church, his eyes narrowed as he watched the dust cloud rising in the distance. He didn't need to wait for confirmation. He knew what it was. They were here. "Clara," he said, turning to her, his face hardening as he spoke. "Stay inside. Keep the others safe." Clara nodded, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that told Carter she wasn't going to back down. She didn't argue, though, as she moved toward the saloon, helping to gather the people inside. They would need to be ready for whatever was coming. Carter took a deep breath, the familiar weight of his revolver resting in his hand. It was heavy, but comforting. The time for hesitation had passed. He couldn't afford to second-guess himself. This wasn't just about survival. This was about the future of Crossbones Ridge. As the riders grew closer, Carter could make out their figures. Men on horseback, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, their movements precise, almost coordinated. There were more of them than Carter had anticipated. At least 10 riders, and possibly more. They had come for him, and this time, they weren't going to leave until they had him. But Carter wasn't going to give up the fight without a battle. He motioned to the townsfolk who had gathered near the barricades. "We hold the line here," he said. "They won't be taking this town." The first riders made their way into the town square, stopping a few dozen yards away from Carter. He could see the leader, a tall man, his face hidden beneath a dark scarf, sizing him up. The man had the look of someone who had spent years hunting, years living by the gun. "I'm not here to waste time," the leader called out, his voice rough, but with an edge of authority. "I want Carter. Now. No one else has to die." Carter stepped forward, his eyes cold and focused. "You won't find him without a fight," he said, his voice carrying across the street. "And I'll make sure you regret it." The leader's eyes narrowed as he studied Carter, then glanced at his men. It was clear that they had come prepared for a fight. But so had Carter. And so had the people of Crossbones Ridge. "You're a stubborn man, Carter," the leader said with a cruel smile. "But you can't hide forever. This town is nothing but a speck on the map. We'll take it, and we'll take you. And when we're done, we'll leave nothing behind." Carter's fingers tightened on the grip of his revolver. He had heard these threats before, seen men like this who believed they could walk into a town and take whatever they wanted. But this time, it wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger. "You're not taking this town," Carter said, his voice steady, unwavering. "Not without a fight." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, the tension building until it was almost unbearable. And then, without warning, the first gunshot rang out and the fight began. The streets of Crossbones Ridge would run red before this was over. The gunshot echoed through the quiet morning, and in an instant, the calm was shattered. The riders from the distance had made their move, and now it was a full-on fight for survival. Carter had no time to waste. His heart hammered in his chest, but his hands were steady as he drew his revolver and took aim. The first shot rang out from the enemy's side, a single shot that missed wide. But Carter had already moved, dropping to the ground behind the wooden cart near the church. He could hear the commotion of hooves pounding against the dirt and the distinct sound of gunfire that followed. His instincts kicked in. His years as a gunslinger hadn't dulled, even though he had hoped they would stay buried. This was a fight he had to win, not for himself, for Crossbones Ridge. The townsfolk had taken their positions behind barricades. Carter had instructed them to stay low, to make every shot count. The town had no experienced fighters, no trained soldiers, just ordinary people who had made their choice to stand and fight. He couldn't let them down. The second wave of shots rang out from the riders. Carter peeked over the cart just in time to see one of the men from the enemy side dismounting, aiming at the barricade. The man's eyes were cold with malice. He had come for blood. Carter's revolver flashed in his hand before the enemy even knew what hit him. The rider dropped, the shock of the shot evident in his wide eyes as he collapsed onto the dusty street. But the battle was far from over. As one of the riders fell, others rushed to fill the gap. They were organized, but Carter could feel the desperation behind their movements. They had underestimated the town, underestimated him. "You've come to the wrong place," Carter muttered to himself, reloading as he moved from cover to cover. Behind him, the town's men were fighting back. Gabe, the blacksmith, had taken up a rifle, his hands shaking but his aim steady. He was behind the barricade, firing shots toward the riders, holding his ground despite the danger. Sheriff Jackson, usually a man of words, had a revolver in his hand now. He was by Carter's side, using every bit of experience he had to cover the town's flanks. The townsfolk weren't experienced, but they were committed. Another shot rang out. This one was aimed at Carter, and he barely ducked in time. The bullet whizzed past his ear, grazing the side of his face. Carter didn't hesitate. He returned fire, the sound of his gun deafening in the quiet of the early morning. The leader of the riders, still on horseback, spurred his horse forward. He raised his gun and fired. This time, The bullet struck one of the barricades, splintering wood and sending debris flying into the air. Carter's heart skipped a beat as he watched one of the townsfolk, a woman named Maggie, fall back behind cover, her hand clutching her arm. "Get down!" Carter shouted, his eyes scanning the battlefield. He had no time to focus on the pain. He couldn't afford it. The town needed him. Maggie struggled but managed to crawl back behind the barricade. She wasn't down for good, but the hit had made it clear. The outlaws weren't holding back anymore. A feeling of grim determination settled over Carter. The enemy leader wasn't backing down either. But Carter could see something the others didn't, an opening. The leader was too focused on the barricades, not paying attention to the space between him and the other riders. It was Carter's chance. He waited for the right moment, watching as the riders closed in on the town's weak point. They had been moving to flank, trying to corner the townsfolk, but Carter knew they weren't prepared for what would come next. A rider was preparing to shoot at Gabe when Carter made his move. He dove from behind his cover, rolling toward a nearby wagon and then sprinting toward the leader's horse. In one fluid motion, Carter leveled his revolver at the leader's chest, the shot ringing out before the man could react. The leader's horse reared in panic, throwing him from the saddle as Carter's bullet found its mark. He didn't hesitate. He knew the others would scramble, trying to make up for the loss. The leader's men hesitated for just a moment, unsure of what to do next. And that was all Carter needed. "Now!" Carter shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Push them back." The townsfolk, encouraged by Carter's quick strike, rallied. The barricades provided cover, and the tide began to shift in their favor. The enemy riders were no longer as coordinated. They were disorganized, thrown off by Carter's swift move. They had underestimated him and the people he was fighting for. But as Carter looked around, his eyes narrowed. They weren't finished yet. The remaining riders had already started to regroup, making a final stand in the middle of the street. They would fight to the bitter end. With every gunshot, Carter's resolve grew. He had spent too long running from his past to let it swallow him again. He would protect the town. He would protect the people here who had trusted him. Another rider was down, the result of Gabe's careful aim. And then one of the bounty hunters on horseback was shot down by Sheriff Jackson, who was becoming more confident by the second. With each shot fired, the town's defenses were proving stronger, and Carter's belief that they could win, against all odds, began to take root. But as the last of the enemy riders began to retreat, Carter knew it wasn't over yet. They had made it clear that they would keep coming, and there was no escaping that reality. "Don't let them leave," Carter called out. "We finish this now." The remaining outlaws fled toward the edge of town, but Carter wasn't about to let them get away so easily. As he charged forward, his revolver in hand, the riders scattered, unsure if they could outrun the fury of the town that had just proven its will to fight. He chased after them, his boots pounding on the dirt, his heart pounding in his chest. One by one, they fell, outlaws who thought they could just ride in, take what they wanted, and leave. But Carter had spent enough of his life letting people like them control the game. The last rider tried to flee, but Carter was faster. He caught up with him just outside the town, and with a single shot, the man fell from his horse, the dust of the trail settling over him. Carter stood over the fallen rider, his breath steady now, his pulse slowing, but his mind was still racing. He had won, but he knew it was only temporary. As the townsfolk gathered around him, weary but relieved, he looked back toward Crossbones Ridge, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the real fight was far from over. This town, these people, they had chosen to stand, and Carter was going to make sure they would always have a reason to keep standing. But it wouldn't be easy. The bounty on his head wasn't going away, and the men who wanted him dead would keep coming. For now, though, he could breathe, because he had protected what mattered. But Carter knew the price of peace, and the true cost of survival, was still to be paid. The streets of Crossbones Ridge were still, but the sense of unease had not left the air. The battle was over, but the war was not. Carter stood at the edge of the town, looking out across the dry land that stretched out beyond. The aftermath of the fight was clear. Broken carts, scattered debris, the bodies of the fallen both in the street and just beyond the town's perimeter. The men who had come to claim Crossbones Ridge had learned a harsh lesson. This town wasn't going to roll over and die. But as Carter wiped the sweat and dust from his brow, he knew that it wasn't over. They would return, and when they did, they would be more prepared, more vicious, and they wouldn't just come for him. They'd come for everyone in the town. Sam. Clara's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but insistent. Carter turned to find her walking toward him, her face lined with concern. She had seen the toll the fight had taken on him, both physically and mentally. He had stood at the front of the battle, fighting not only for the town, but for something he had almost forgotten. Hope. But hope, Carter knew, came with a price. "You're not thinking of going after them, are you?" Clara asked, her eyes searching his face. Carter didn't answer immediately. His gaze flickered to the horizon once again. He could feel the tension building inside him, the urge to finish what had started, to take the fight to them before they could come back. But he couldn't make that decision on his own. Not anymore. "I need to protect this town, Clara," Carter said quietly, his voice filled with resolve. "I can't just let them think they can walk in here, take what they want, and leave. I won't let them." Clara placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him, pulling him back from the edge. "You're not alone in this," she said firmly. "We'll face whatever comes next together." Carter looked down at her hand, his heart heavy with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. He had spent so many years trying to protect those he loved from the life he had lived, from the man he had been. And now, here they were, standing together, fighting for something they both believed in. He nodded slowly, his mind still racing. "I know, but we need to be ready. If they're coming back, we need to know when. We need to prepare." Clara looked over his shoulder, toward the barricades the townsfolk had put up, and the look of quiet determination in her eyes mirrored his own. She understood what he meant. They couldn't afford to sit back and wait. This wasn't over, and they needed to be ready. As the sun sank lower, Carter gathered the town's residents in the saloon, using the same strategy he had used when they'd first faced Harland and the bounty hunters, a united front. The streets were quiet now, but the tension was palpable. The people knew what was coming. They had seen what happened when the outlaws had descended upon their town, and now, more than ever, they knew they had to stand their ground. "We've fought once," Carter began, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "And we've won, but they'll be back. There are more of them out there, and they won't stop until they have what they want. The bounty on my head is too high for them to ignore." A murmur ran through the crowd, but Carter held up his hand, silencing them. He had seen fear in the eyes of these people, but he had also seen something else, something stronger than fear. They had made their choice. They had chosen to fight for their town, and now they would have to make sure they were ready for what was coming. "We need to fortify the town," Carter continued. "Barricades, watch posts, whatever we can do to slow them down. And we need to stay vigilant. The next time they come, they'll come harder. They'll come prepared." One by one, the townsfolk nodded, some of them standing taller, more determined than before. Gabe, the blacksmith, stepped forward, his hands rough from years of work but steady now, like a man who had found purpose. "I'll help with the barricades," he said. "We've got wood and nails, but we need to make sure they're solid, that they can hold." Sheriff Jackson stood beside Carter, his hands still resting on his holstered revolver. "I can organize the lookout posts," he said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "We'll need to keep watch all night." As the townsfolk began to disperse, breaking into groups to organize the defenses, Carter turned to Clara, his eyes filled with both gratitude and worry. He knew the town was depending on him, and that was a weight he had never wanted to carry. But here, now, it was the only choice they had. "I don't know what's coming next, Clara," Carter said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if we're ready for this." Clara met his gaze, her expression softening. "You've already shown them what you're capable of, Sam. And they've shown you that they'll fight for this town, just like you will. You're not alone in this." Carter reached out, his hand brushing against hers, his fingers threading through hers as if to ground himself in the present. The moment felt fragile, as if everything they had fought for hung in the balance. But for the first time in a long time, Carter felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. The night passed slowly, the sounds of hammers and nails filling the air as the town fortified itself. Carter barely slept, his mind running over every detail, every possibility. He kept to his usual routine, making sure everything was in place, making sure the townsfolk were ready for what would come next. As the first light of dawn broke across the horizon, Carter stood on the church's porch, his eyes scanning the horizon once more. The town was ready, but the question that remained in his mind was the one he had been dreading for days. When would they come? How long would they have to wait before the storm broke? And when it did, would they be strong enough to face it? The wind had picked up again, dust swirling through the streets of Crossbones Ridge as Carter looked back at the town, at the people he had vowed to protect. He didn't know how much longer they had, but one thing was clear. They weren't running anymore. They weren't hiding. Crossbones Ridge would stand its ground, and when the reckoning came, Carter would face it, no matter the cost. The day passed slowly, and the tension in Crossbones Ridge was palpable. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the town that seemed to stretch across the dirt streets like a warning. The people of Crossbones Ridge had spent the day reinforcing every possible position, every door, every window. Carter and the others had organized lookout posts, set up barriers, and ensured that everyone knew where to go if the worst happened. But as the hours wore on, that sense of anticipation, of something just beyond their reach, grew. It wasn't the chaos of battle they were waiting for. It was the certainty of it, the calm before the storm. And in that silence, the waiting began to gnaw at the edges of Carter's mind. He found himself on the porch of the church once again, watching as the last rays of daylight flickered across the town. The streets were still, too still, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. Clara joined him, her footsteps soft on the wood of the porch. She didn't need to say anything. She simply stood beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. Carter could feel her gaze on him, even without looking at her, and he knew she could feel the same unease that he did. They both knew it was only a matter of time before the outlaws, the bounty hunters, returned. It was just a question of when. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" Clara asked, her voice soft but steady, cutting through the silence between them. Carter didn't immediately respond. He wasn't sure how to explain what he was feeling. The fear, the tension, the need to protect everyone. He had done what he could, but it felt like there was more to be done, more that he couldn't control. He had been in enough battles to know that waiting for the other side to strike was just as dangerous as fighting in the first place. "I don't know if we're ready for this," Carter finally said, his voice rough. "I've seen what they can do, and it's hard to shake the feeling that no matter what we do, it won't be enough." Clara's hand found his, her fingers curling around his as if to offer reassurance. "We're ready, Sam. We've done everything we can, and we're stronger than you think. This town, these people, they're ready to fight, just like you are." Her words were simple, but they hit Carter harder than he expected. He had spent so much time focusing on what they didn't have, what they couldn't do, that he had forgotten what they did have. The townsfolk, the people who had fought beside him, who had chosen to stand when they could have easily run. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for something greater, for a future. Carter squeezed her hand, his eyes finally turning toward her. "Thank you," he whispered, the words carrying more weight than they ever had before. He didn't need her to tell him that everything would be all right. He just needed her to be there, beside him, through whatever came next. As they stood together, the quiet of the evening began to stretch into a more oppressive stillness. Carter's mind wandered back to the gunfights he had fought in his younger years, the ones where the enemy would strike at the least expected moment. He had learned to trust his instincts, but the waiting always felt the hardest. In the West, it was the waiting that would make or break you. And this time, it felt like the waiting would be the hardest part of all. It wasn't until the first rider appeared, silhouetted against the fading light, that the tension broke. The rider moved slowly, deliberately, and Carter's eyes narrowed as he scanned the figure in the distance. He could feel it in his bones. The storm was finally here. Clara's grip tightened on his hand. "Is it them?" she asked, her voice low. "I don't know," Carter replied, his gaze never leaving the rider. "But it's time to find out." The rider's approach was slow but steady, and as he came closer, Carter could make out his features. A man in a dark coat, his hat pulled low over his eyes, riding alone. Carter's hand moved to the revolver at his side, his body tensing as the man neared. He wasn't sure if this was the beginning of the attack, or if this was just a scout, a messenger. The man came to a halt just outside the town square, and Carter stepped forward to meet him. He wasn't about to take any chances, not after everything that had happened. "You're alone?" Carter called out, his voice steady but carrying across the distance. The rider lifted his head slightly, revealing his face. A rugged man, weathered by the years, with a scar running down the side of his face. He didn't seem threatening at first glance, but Carter knew better than to trust appearances. "I'm alone for now," the man replied, his voice gruff. "But that could change quickly. Your town's got a reputation now, Carter. You've killed a few of us, but you don't know what's coming. You don't know what's waiting out there." Carter's eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Come to make a deal? Or come to finish what you started?" The rider shook his head, his lips curling into a thin, humorless smile. "No deal. Just a warning. You think you're safe here, but you're not. I'm not the one you need to worry about. There's a lot more coming, and they won't be as kind as I am." Carter's hand never left the grip of his revolver, but he didn't draw it yet. He was watching this man, trying to gauge his intentions. The rider hadn't pulled a weapon, hadn't made any hostile moves. But Carter knew that the moment he let his guard down was the moment the rest of the gang would strike. "So you came here to warn me?" Carter asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "Why?" The rider met his gaze steadily. "Because it's no fun killing a man who isn't ready to die. But you're too dangerous for them to leave alive. I'm just making sure you know what's coming, and that you know this is your last warning." The rider kicked his horse into motion, turning his back on Carter as he rode off into the gathering twilight. Carter watched him leave, the man's words echoing in his mind. This wasn't a warning, it was a promise. And Carter knew one thing for sure, the storm was coming. He turned back toward Clara, his expression grim. "They're coming," he said quietly, "and when they do, we'll be ready." The wait was over. Crossbones Ridge was about to face the reckoning. The rider's warning lingered in the air, heavy with the weight of inevitability. Carter stood in the street, his eyes fixed on the trail where the rider had disappeared, the silence pressing in on him like a vice. His mind was racing, but his body was still, the quiet before the storm settling around him like the calm before a flood. The sun had long since set, and the shadows were deepening, stretching across Crossbones Ridge like an ominous curtain. The barricades were ready, the town's defenses solidified, but Carter knew better than anyone. Preparation meant nothing if you weren't prepared to face the full force of what was coming. Behind him, Clara stood silently, her presence grounding him even in the midst of the growing tension. He didn't turn to face her, but he could feel the way she watched him, could feel the silent understanding between them. They were in this together, no matter what happened next. "I thought we were done with this," Carter muttered, his voice low as he stared into the night, listening for any signs of movement. "We've been through worse," Clara said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty hanging in the air. "And we'll make it through this. Together." Carter's jaw tightened, and he nodded slowly. She was right. They had fought for this town. They had fought for each other. And no matter what came next, he wasn't going to let it all be for nothing. By the time the first sounds of hooves reached their ears, the entire town was on high alert. Carter and Clara were back inside the saloon with the others, the room tense with anticipation. The townsfolk had gathered there, keeping their eyes on the windows, on the road outside. Everyone knew what was coming. No one spoke, but their hands were ready, their weapons within arm's reach. Carter stood near the door, his revolver in hand. He was calm, his breathing steady, but his senses were sharpened. His mind kept going back to the rider's words. "They won't be as kind as I am." Those words rang in his ears like a curse. The man had been a messenger, but his message was clear. They were not going to give up until Carter was dead and the town was in ruins. The hooves grew louder, and Carter could feel the tension rise in the air. It wasn't just the riders approaching. It was the weight of everything they had built, everything they had fought for, now hanging on the precipice of destruction. Suddenly, the door of the saloon creaked open and Sheriff Jackson stepped inside. His face was grim, his eyes wide with urgency. "They're here," Jackson said, his voice low. "And there's more of them than we thought. They're circling the town." Carter nodded, his heart quickening as the gravity of the situation settled over him. "How many?" "At least 20, Jackson replied, his jaw set. "More could be on the way. They've got the whole town surrounded. I don't think they're here for anything but blood." Carter's hand tightened around his revolver. He could hear the distant sounds of the riders spreading out, flanking the town, getting closer. The plan had always been simple: hold the line, protect the town, and keep the fight from spilling into the streets. But it was clear now that the fight was coming to them, and there was no way to avoid it. "We fight," Carter said firmly, his voice ringing out in the stillness of the room. "We hold them off as long as we can. We protect this town, no matter what." He turned to face the group of townsfolk who had gathered behind him, their faces a mix of fear and resolve. These were the same people who had stood by him in the first battle, and they were ready to fight again. "I know you're scared," Carter continued, his voice steady. "But fear is just another weapon they can use against us. You stand tall, you stand together, and you fight for this town. You fight for your families, for your lives." The townsfolk nodded, their faces hardening with determination. Carter could feel their resolve solidifying, their fear beginning to melt away. They weren't just standing by anymore. They were standing tall, ready to face whatever the riders had planned. The first shots rang out just after dusk. The night was split open by the crack of gunfire, the sound reverberating off the buildings as the riders launched their attack. Carter's heart raced as he bolted for the door, his revolver already raised. He could hear the gunfire coming from all directions, the chaos already unfolding in the streets. He dashed out of the saloon, moving toward the nearest barricade where Gabe, the blacksmith, was already in position, rifle in hand. Gabe nodded as Carter approached, his expression grim but determined. The rest of the townsfolk had taken their positions behind cover, but the outlaws were closing in fast. Carter's mind raced as he looked around the town square. The streets were narrow, and the buildings lined up in a way that provided good cover, but only for so long. The outlaws had the advantage of numbers, and Carter knew they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. "Stay low, stay sharp," Carter called to the group. "They'll come at us from every angle. We can't let them get close." The sound of galloping hooves grew louder, and Carter's grip tightened on his gun. There were too many riders, too many outlaws eager for blood. He had fought this fight before, but this time, it felt different. This wasn't just about survival. It was about showing the outlaws that Crossbones Ridge was no longer a town they could take. The first rider appeared at the corner of the saloon, aiming his gun at Gabe. But Carter was faster. With a quick, practiced movement, he fired, the bullet tearing through the air and striking the rider in the chest before he could fire a shot. "Keep your heads down," Carter yelled, as another wave of riders appeared, charging down the main street, firing as they approached. The gunfire was deafening, and the smoke hung thick in the air as the townsfolk fought back with everything they had. Gabe fired another shot, taking down another rider. Sheriff Jackson aimed from a lookout post, his revolver steady as he picked off one of the men who had gotten too close. But there were still too many. Carter ducked behind a barrel, his mind calculating the next move. The outlaws were closing in, their guns blazing as they made their way toward the barricades. This wasn't just a fight, it was a siege. They were trying to wear them down, to overwhelm them. He couldn't let that happen. "Everyone, fall back," Carter shouted. "Head for the church. We can't stay here." But before anyone could move, a shot rang out from the far end of town, and one of the townsfolk, Maggie, collapsed, clutching her side. Carter's heart skipped a beat, and for a split second, everything seemed to stop. "No!" he shouted, moving toward her. But the outlaws were already on them, pushing forward with force. They were closing in, and Carter knew they couldn't keep up this fight for much longer. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but as he stood over Maggie, his mind raced. They had no choice. They had to make a stand. "Hold your ground," Carter yelled. "This is our town, and we're not giving it up without a fight." The final push had begun. The sounds of the battle swirled around Carter like a violent storm. The gunfire echoed through the narrow streets of Crossbones Ridge, ricocheting off the walls of the buildings, filling the air with the acrid scent of gunpowder and the heavy, oppressive weight of desperation. Every shot, every scream, every movement felt like the edge of a knife, and Carter knew that the outcome of this fight would determine the fate of the town. He stood over Maggie, the wounded woman clinging to life with every breath she took. Blood stained the dirt beneath her, her face pale, but her eyes, though clouded with pain, were filled with a quiet determination. She wasn't the first to fall, and she wouldn't be the last, but her strength in that moment was something Carter couldn't ignore. "We'll get you to safety," Carter said through gritted teeth, crouching beside her and looking for any sign of movement. He could hear the shouts of the outlaws closing in, their voices filled with the promise of violence. They weren't just here for Carter anymore. They were here to take everything. Maggie managed a weak smile, her breath coming in short gasps. "Don't worry about me. Just protect the others," she murmured, her words barely audible over the noise of the battle. Carter didn't respond right away. He could hear Clara calling out to the townsfolk, her voice strained but strong, urging them to fall back to the church. The barricades had been breached, and the outlaws were pressing forward. The town was on the brink, but they hadn't surrendered yet. A wave of gunfire erupted from the far side of town, followed by the unmistakable sound of a horse charging into the fray. Carter turned his attention back to Maggie. "You're not staying here alone," he said, his voice low but firm. He hoisted her carefully into his arms, his body straining from the weight of the battle, but there was no time to hesitate. He could feel the sting of exhaustion creeping into his muscles, but it wasn't just his own survival that mattered anymore. It was the survival of everyone in this town. With Maggie in his arms, he ran toward the church, the sound of hooves and gunfire growing louder with every step. They weren't just coming for him. They were coming for everything they had built. Crossbones Ridge wasn't a place for the faint of heart, but Carter knew that even here, in the dust and the heat of the West, there were limits to how much a man could take. As Carter made his way to the church, he could see the other townsfolk retreating behind the barricades that had been hastily erected in the building's doorway. The street was littered with the dead, both townsfolk and outlaws, and the air hung thick with the smell of smoke and sweat. The final stand had begun. He kicked open the church doors and rushed inside, where Clara was already at the front, giving orders, her face set in a look of grim resolve. Behind her, the rest of the town's defenders were taking cover behind pews, rifles in hand, waiting for the final wave of riders to make their move. Carter gently lowered Maggie onto the ground near the altar, and Clara was by his side in an instant, her hands shaking as she checked Maggie's wound. "She's losing too much blood," Clara said urgently, her voice tight with panic, but she quickly masked it. "She won't last much longer unless we get her help." "I know," Carter replied, "but we can't leave her. We need to hold the line, Clara." Clara's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, the weight of everything they had fought for seemed to hang in the balance. But then, without a word, she nodded, her resolve hardening as she turned to tend to Maggie's injury. Carter turned his attention back to the front of the church, where the sounds of the riders had become deafening. The time for hiding was over. The town was surrounded. The outlaws would be coming through the doors soon, and this was their last chance to make a stand. "Everyone, to your positions," Carter shouted, his voice commanding and filled with urgency. "We hold them off, no matter what." Sheriff Jackson stepped forward, his gun raised and ready. He had seen the brutality of the West firsthand, but he had never witnessed a town come together like this before. The people of Crossbones Ridge were standing tall, their fear replaced by something stronger, a quiet determination to protect the place they had chosen to call home. As the first rider appeared at the doorway of the church, Carter's instincts kicked in. The man was quick, his gun drawn, but Carter was faster. A single shot rang out, striking the rider in the chest before he could even raise his weapon. The door to the church was quickly barricaded, but the outlaws were already pressing forward. There would be no escape. The second wave of riders arrived in force. They weren't backing down. and they wouldn't stop until Carter was dead. Carter stood behind the barricade, his revolver steady in his hand. His eyes flickered from the riders to the townsfolk around him. They were scared, but they weren't running. They were ready to fight, ready to defend what they had. "I'll hold them off from here," Carter called out. "Get ready to fire when they break through." The tension was unbearable as the first few riders slammed into the church's door. The sound of their impact echoed through the walls, and Carter could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the others moving into position, the hum of anticipation filling the space between them. Then, with a final, deafening crash, the doors splintered open. The riders flooded in, guns blazing, their faces masked with fury. The sound of gunfire erupted in every direction, and Carter could feel the chaos descending upon them like a tidal wave. His first shot took down one rider, his body crumpling to the ground as the others charged forward. The town's defenders responded with precision, the sound of rifle fire joining the din of revolvers and the unmistakable thud of boots on the wooden floor. It was a massacre. Carter moved swiftly, taking down rider after rider, each one falling with the weight of the town's defiance behind it. But the outlaws were relentless, and Carter could feel the desperation mounting as more and more riders flooded into the church, forcing the defenders back toward the altar. The battle raged on, but Carter knew that they couldn't hold out forever. The tide was turning, and just as he thought they might be overrun, a voice rang out from the back of the church. "Carter, we've got company." It was Gabe, his voice filled with urgency. Carter turned just in time to see a group of riders break through the back of the church, their guns raised, ready to strike. It was a trap. Carter's heart raced as he realized they had been surrounded. He had no idea how they had gotten in, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was the final battle. And it wasn't just for Crossbones Ridge. It was for the future, for everything they had fought for. The chaos within the church reached a fever pitch as the outlaws surged forward, their guns drawn, their faces twisted in cruel grins. Carter could hear the frantic shouts of the townsfolk, the sound of weapons firing, and the unmistakable crackle of splintering wood as more barricades gave way under the pressure. The battle that had started on the streets was now trapped inside the walls of the church, and Carter could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. Gabe's voice echoed from the back of the church again, urgent, but tinged with fear. "Carter, we're being overrun." Carter's heart slammed in his chest, but he didn't hesitate. He had faced impossible odds before, and this would be no different. He could see the riders moving through the gaps in the barricades, their eyes full of bloodlust. But Carter had learned long ago that when the world was stacked against you, you either found a way to fight or you didn't survive. And he wasn't ready to give up. He spun, his revolver steady in his hand. He took out one rider, then another, moving like lightning, his gunfire the only sound that kept the chaos at bay. But they were getting closer, too close. The town's defenders were spread thin, their shots wild, their ammunition running low. Carter knew that they couldn't hold out much longer. "Everyone, fall back to the altar," Carter yelled. "Don't let them push you any further." Sheriff Jackson, a man who had never fired a shot in anger before today, was firing with deadly accuracy now. His eyes were wide with fear, but his aim was unwavering. Gabe, the blacksmith, had set up a makeshift rifle position behind the last remaining barrier, trying to keep the riders at bay. And Clara had taken up her own rifle and was firing from the back, her aim sharp, each shot landing true as she stood by Carter's side. But the riders were relentless. They weren't just trying to take the town. They were trying to crush everything Carter had fought for. And with each passing moment, the battle became more desperate. Then, just when it seemed like all was lost, Carter heard it. Hoofbeats, rhythmic and steady, growing louder by the second. At first, he thought it was more riders, but as the sound drew nearer, it became clear. It wasn't just the enemy approaching. It was reinforcements. Carter turned sharply, his hand still steady on his revolver. From the far side of the town, he saw a group of riders appear, their figures silhouetted against the dimming sky. They weren't wearing the dark garb of the outlaws. These riders had a different look, grimy, battle-worn faces, but they weren't the enemy. They were townsfolk. "You were right, Carter," came a voice from behind him. It was Gabe, his face streaked with sweat and blood. "We've got backup." The reinforcements poured into the town with the precision of a well-trained group. Their rifles raised, they dove straight into the fray, cutting down any outlaws in their path. Carter's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the faces of familiar townsfolk, farmers, ranchers, and others who had made the decision to fight. They weren't soldiers, but they were fighters. "Stay with me, Gabe," Carter shouted, his voice barely heard over the chaos. "We've got one shot at this." Gabe nodded, his breath coming in short gasps. "We take him at the gates, Carter. We hit him hard. They won't expect it." With the reinforcements now on their side, the tide began to shift. The outlaws, momentarily stunned by the arrival of new fighters, hesitated. That hesitation was all Carter needed. He ordered his men to push forward, each one of them fighting with the ferocity of a person with everything on the line. Carter led the charge, moving with precision, his eyes scanning the chaos for targets. He fired, taking down one outlaw, then another, as he made his way toward the back of the church where the reinforcements were cutting through the enemy lines. He had no time to think. He didn't know how many riders there were, but he knew this. If they didn't act fast, they'd be swallowed by the chaos. Sheriff Jackson had positioned himself by the windows, taking out one rider after another, his hands trembling with every shot but still landing his targets. Gabe and the other reinforcements set up in the alleyways, picking off any riders trying to break through. And Carter was in the thick of it, moving with purpose, a man who had seen death too many times to be afraid of it now. It wasn't long before the outlaws began to retreat. Their numbers thinned, their morale shattered. The battle had shifted, and now it was the townsfolk who were pressing the advantage. "Push him back," Carter yelled, his voice cutting through the gunfire. "Now, don't let him get away." The last wave of riders faltered. They were no longer attacking with the same force. They were scrambling, unsure whether to press on or to retreat. Carter could see the fear in their eyes. They had underestimated the town, underestimated the fight that was within these people. And then, just like that, the remaining outlaws broke. The sounds of retreat echoed through the streets as the riders scrambled to flee, their once confident advance now a chaotic rout. The townsfolk didn't let up, though. They pursued, cutting down any rider who thought they could escape with their lives. Carter stood at the center of the chaos, his revolver still raised, but his eyes scanning the battlefield, ensuring that the threat was gone. His heart raced, his chest heaving from the exertion, but he didn't allow himself to relax. Not yet. When the last of the riders disappeared into the distance, Carter finally lowered his weapon. The town had won, for now. Clara was at his side, her face pale but resolute. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They both knew the truth. This victory was temporary. But for tonight, Crossbones Ridge had withstood the storm. And that was enough. The people of the town were gathering around, their faces weary but full of pride. They had fought together, and they had won. But Carter's mind was already turning toward the future. The bounty on his head, the outlaws who would return, and the fight that was far from over. For now, though, they could rest. The battle had been won. But Carter knew better than to think it was over. The war for Crossbones Ridge had only just begun. The night fell heavy and quiet over Crossbones Ridge. The wind had picked up, swirling dust across the empty streets as the firelight from the saloon flickered like distant stars. The battle had been won, but Carter knew the cost. The town had stood its ground, but they had lost people, friends, and a piece of their innocence. It was hard to call it a victory when the price was written in blood. Inside the saloon, the survivors gathered, their faces worn, their bodies bruised and bloody, but their eyes, those eyes, spoke of something more than just survival. They spoke of defiance. They had fought back, and they had done it together. Carter stood near the bar, his hand gripping the worn wood as he stared into his glass, the reflection of the flames dancing across its surface. The taste of gunpowder was still in the air, and the sting of sweat and blood lingered on his skin. Clara stood beside him, her eyes scanning the room, her face calm but heavy with the same burden he carried. She had fought, too. She hadn't flinched when the gunfire started, when the outlaws had come crashing through the doors. She had stood her ground, just like the rest of them. But Carter could see the strain in her eyes, the quiet exhaustion that settled deeper into her bones with every passing minute. "You're not done yet, are you?" Clara asked quietly, her voice soft but knowing. Carter didn't look up. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Clara. They're coming back. And I don't know if we can keep fighting like this." Clara's fingers brushed his arm, a gentle touch that pulled his gaze to her. Her eyes were steady, strong. "We'll find a way. You don't have to carry this burden alone, Sam. Not anymore." He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, her steady presence a reminder of everything he had fought for. Clara wasn't just by his side. She was his anchor, the one person who had never given up on him. But he knew, deep down, that it wasn't enough to just keep fighting. "I've been running for too long," he said quietly. "But I don't know if there's any peace for a man like me." Clara's expression softened, her hand resting on his shoulder. "Maybe you'll never find the peace you're looking for, Sam. But that doesn't mean you stop trying to find it. And it doesn't mean you stop protecting the people who depend on you." A silence hung between them. Carter's gaze flickered around the room, to the townsfolk who had fought beside him, who had risked everything to protect what they had. He saw fear in their eyes, but also something else, something stronger. They were scared, yes, but they weren't giving up. "I made a promise to these people," Carter murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told them I'd protect them, but I don't know how long I can keep that promise." "Then you don't have to do it alone," Clara said, her voice fierce with quiet conviction. "You've got all of us, every single one of us. And we're not going anywhere." Carter nodded, swallowing hard. The weight of his own thoughts pressed against him, but Clara's words, her unwavering faith, grounded him. He had spent so much time alone, thinking he had to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. But she was right. They had all chosen to fight, and they had all chosen to stand together. But that didn't change the reality of the situation. The outlaws would return. The bounty on his head would never disappear. And while the town had won for now, Carter knew the peace they had earned was fragile. It was only a matter of time before another storm came. The next morning came too quickly, and Carter stood outside the church, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The town was quiet, and the air was thick with the aftermath of the battle. The streets had been cleared, the bodies of the fallen riders taken away. The survivors, however, were still here, still standing. Sheriff Jackson was walking toward him, his hat low over his eyes, his face drawn but resolute. The sheriff had seen plenty of violence in his time, but nothing like what had come to Crossbones Ridge. Now, Jackson had a look of a man who had seen too much and yet knew there was no turning back. "We held him off," Jackson said, his voice gravelly. "But I don't think we can keep this up much longer, Carter." Carter turned to face him, his hand resting on the hilt of his revolver, a familiar weight. "We can't stop fighting, Jackson. Not now. If we give up now, they'll come for us again, and they won't stop. Not until they take everything." "I'm not saying we give up," Jackson said, his voice rising with frustration. "But we've got no backup, no reinforcements, and we're running low on supplies. We don't have the firepower to fend off another wave like that." Carter looked over at the town, seeing the familiar faces of the townsfolk. But now, there was a sense of unease. They had fought valiantly, but they had lost too much. The men they had killed in the streets were only part of the problem. The real threat, the one that loomed over them like a dark cloud, was still out there, waiting. "We need more than just firepower," Carter said, his voice heavy with resolve. "We need to send a message. A message that says we're not just gonna roll over." Jackson nodded slowly. "I hear ya. But who do we send that message to?" Carter's eyes narrowed as he looked at the horizon, the thought forming in his mind like a flicker of light. "We don't just send it to them. We send it to anyone who thinks they can take this town. We make sure everyone knows that Crossbones Ridge isn't for sale. We fight for it. We fight until they understand that this town belongs to the people who live here." Jackson met Carter's gaze, and for a brief moment, a flicker of something passed between them. An understanding, a shared resolve. They couldn't fight forever, but they would fight for as long as they had the strength. They would stand against the tide, and if it took everything they had, they would make sure Crossbones Ridge was never just a pawn in someone else's game. "We've got one shot at this," Carter said, his voice low but firm. "We make it count." And as Carter watched the sun rise higher into the sky, a thought settled in his mind, one that had been nagging at him ever since he'd taken the first shot. He was no longer just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something bigger, for the town, for its future, and for the people who had made the decision to stand by him. It wasn't over. Not yet. The town of Crossbones Ridge was a powder keg, and Carter was the match that would either ignite it or keep it smoldering. The morning light, filtering through the clouds, painted the town in an eerie glow as he stood outside the church, his eyes scanning the horizon. The battle from the night before had been hard-fought, and while they had won, the cost was too high to ignore. People were dead. There were wounds that wouldn't heal. But the greatest wound of all was the knowledge that it wouldn't end here. The Outlaws would be back, and the town would need to be ready. As Carter turned back toward the town, he saw the residents moving about, their faces tired but determined. The ones who had fought through the chaos were ready to do it again, ready to defend what they had left. But there was a gnawing sense of unease in the air. People had seen too much of the brutality to believe this was over. They could feel the calm before the next storm. Carter walked to the saloon, where the townsfolk had gathered. He pushed open the door, the smell of dust and smoke hanging in the air. Clara was there, helping Maggie, who had made it through the night but was still gravely wounded. Gabe was speaking to Sheriff Jackson, the two of them trying to make sense of the mess the Outlaws had left behind. Carter stepped inside, his boots making a soft sound on the creaky wooden floor. Clara turned when she saw him, her face still pale from the previous night, but there was something in her eyes, an unspoken promise. She knew that the battle they had fought had only been a glimpse of what was to come, and still, she stood beside him, unwavering. "Everyone's pulling together," Clara said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion. "They're not giving up, Sam. Not after everything." Carter nodded, but didn't speak right away. He could hear the murmurs of the town rising in the background. Talk of preparations, talk of fortifications, talk of what they would do next. Everyone had a role. Everyone was doing their part. But Carter knew that none of that would matter unless they had something the Outlaws feared. They needed a plan that would send a message, not just to the men coming for them, but to anyone else who might have thoughts of claiming this town. Gabe walked over to Carter, wiping his hands on his pants. His face was set in a determined grimace. "We can't keep hiding behind barricades forever. We need to make a move. Take the fight to them before they regroup." Sheriff Jackson spoke up, his voice gruff as always. "I agree. We've shown we can hold the line, but we've got no backup, no way to keep this up indefinitely. We need more than just defense." Carter turned his gaze to the floor, his mind racing. He had been running from his past for so long, trying to bury the man he used to be, the man who had fought to survive. But the truth was, there was no escape. This was his fight, whether he wanted it or not. He looked up, meeting Gabe in Jackson's eyes. "We take the fight to them," Carter said, his voice low but full of purpose. "We gather everyone, every man and woman who can carry a weapon, and we show them that Crossbones Ridge isn't going to fall." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "You think we can stand up to the kind of numbers they'll have? They'll be back in full force." "We won't stand back," Carter replied. "We make sure they know they'll pay a price for every step they take toward this town. We'll send a message, loud and clear. If they want me, they'll have to come through every last person in this town." Clara walked toward him, placing a hand on his arm. "And when they do, Sam, what happens then?" Carter's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the weight of everything settled over him. He didn't have a perfect answer, but there was one truth he couldn't ignore. "Then we make them regret it." The following day, the town rallied. Word spread quickly. Everyone who could fight was called to action. They gathered in the town square, Carter at the forefront, his heart beating hard in his chest. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about taking back control. The townsfolk worked quickly, setting up watchposts, reinforcing the barricades, and gathering supplies. They worked in unison, as if this fight wasn't just Carter's, but theirs. Gabe, Jackson, and the others helped organize the defense. But Carter knew that words would only carry them so far. What they needed now was action. They needed to make the outlaws understand that they weren't just defending a town. They were defending their lives. By midday, the town was as prepared as it would ever be. Carter stood in the square, looking out at the people who had gathered to fight with him. They were all different: farmers, ranchers, miners. But in that moment, they were all united by the same cause. "We stand together," Carter said, his voice carrying across the square. "We fight for this town. We fight for our families. And we fight for the future we want." Clara stood at his side, her rifle ready, her expression fierce. Carter could feel her strength in that moment, the same strength that had been his anchor through all of this. She wasn't just standing beside him. She was standing with him, ready to face whatever came next. Carter's eyes scanned the crowd, and he saw the same look in their eyes that he had seen in Clara's, the unspoken promise that they would fight for something more than just survival. They would fight for the future they had built. The wind picked up again, kicking dust across the street, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to pause. The weight of what was about to happen hung over them all. But Carter didn't look away. He wasn't about to let the outlaws take this town, not without a fight. By late afternoon, the first signs of movement appeared on the horizon. The riders were coming. Carter didn't need to see them up close to know what was coming. He could feel it in the air, like a storm just before it broke. "We're ready," Jackson said, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed the same unease everyone else felt. "They're on the move." Carter nodded. "Let's make sure they know this isn't their town. Let's make sure they know they've made a mistake coming here." With that, the town braced for the next wave. They had prepared as much as they could, but they knew this would be the fight that determined everything. As the first riders appeared on the edge of the town, the people of Crossbones Ridge stood their ground. The outlaws had underestimated them before. They wouldn't make that mistake again. Carter looked to Clara once more, his heart steady, his resolve firm. "This is it," he said. "This is the moment." She nodded. "Then let's make it count." And with that, the battle began. The storm had arrived. The dust kicked up around Carter as the riders appeared on the horizon, a dark line against the fading light of the day. The sound of hooves pounded the earth, echoing through the streets of Crossbones Ridge like a drumbeat, steady and relentless. Carter's hand tightened around the grip of his revolver, and his gaze never wavered from the advancing riders. The time for talking was over. The outlaws were coming, and they wouldn't stop until they had taken everything. But Carter wasn't about to let them have it. Not without one hell of a fight. "We're ready," Sheriff Jackson said, his voice low but confident. "Let them come. We've got the advantage this time." Carter didn't answer, but his heart pounded with the familiar rhythm of battle. This was it, the final confrontation. He had no illusions about what was at stake. The outlaws weren't just here for him anymore. They were here for the town, for the people who had made the choice to stand with him. They were here to take it all. He turned his attention back to the riders, who were closing in on the town. The horses moved with the confidence of men who thought they had already won. But they didn't know what awaited them. They didn't know how far Carter and the people of Crossbones Ridge were willing to go. "Hold the line," Carter called out, his voice steady, but filled with urgency. "Don't let them break through." The townsfolk were in position now, hiding behind the barricades, their rifles ready, their eyes fixed on the riders. Gabe, Jackson, Clara, all of them were waiting for the signal. And Carter would give it. When the time came, they would fight with everything they had. The riders reached the outskirts of the town, their numbers now clear to see. At least 30 men, some of them on horseback, others on foot, their faces grim and determined. They had come for Carter, but they would find much more than they expected. The first rider drew his gun, firing toward the barricades. The bullet struck a nearby wall, sending a spray of dust into the air. The shot rang out, and in that moment, Carter's instincts kicked in. He stepped out from behind cover, his revolver raised, and fired in one smooth motion. The first rider fell, his body jerking violently before hitting the dirt. The outlaws hesitated for a moment, stunned by the suddenness of the attack. But Carter didn't wait for them to regroup. He fired again, taking down another rider as they scrambled to react. "Now!" Carter shouted. The town's defenders opened fire, the sound of gunshots echoing through the streets as the battle erupted. Carter's eyes were fixed on the enemy, his mind calculating each move, each shot. He could hear the shouts of the outlaws as they tried to push forward, but they weren't prepared for the kind of fight the people of Crossbones Ridge were bringing. The first wave of riders fell quickly, their numbers thinning as the townsfolk picked them off one by one. But there were more coming, more than Carter had anticipated. He could see them circling the town, trying to find a way in. They wouldn't stop, not unless they were forced to. The second wave hit hard, with riders charging straight for the barricades. The ground shook beneath the pounding hooves as they surged forward, their guns raised. Carter took cover behind a nearby barrel, his revolver blazing as he fired shot after shot. But there were too many of them. They were pushing in, getting closer. Gabe's voice rang out from the other side of the barricade. "They're coming from the east. We need more firepower." Carter turned to Jackson, who was firing from a position behind a wooden crate. "We can't hold forever. We need to take out their leaders. If we break their command, the rest will scatter." Jackson nodded. "I'll cover you. Get to the church and take out the ones holding the line." Carter didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. The church was the last line of defense, and the outlaws knew it. If he could get inside and take out their leaders, the battle might finally shift in their favor. He turned to Clara, her rifle steady in her hands as she aimed at another rider. "Stay safe," he said, his voice low. Clara nodded, but there was no fear in her eyes, only resolve. "You too." With that, Carter broke from cover, moving swiftly through the smoke and gunfire toward the church. He dodged behind buildings and barrels, using the terrain to stay out of sight. The outlaws' focus was split between the barricades and the rest of the town, but Carter knew that if he could get inside the church, he could turn the tide. He reached the church's door, his hand on the handle, and paused. The sound of footsteps inside told him the enemy was already here. Carter pushed the door open slowly, his revolver raised, ready for anything. Inside, the church was dim, the only light coming from the cracks in the wooden walls and the faint glow of burning torches. The outlaws had taken up position behind pews, firing through the windows, but they didn't expect Carter to be right there. He moved quickly, taking down 2 men before they even saw him. Their bodies dropped with a dull thud, and the rest of the outlaws inside the church scrambled to react. Carter fired again, hitting another rider in the chest before he could pull his gun. The remaining men turned to face him, but Carter was already moving, faster than they could react. He shot another rider in the leg, taking him down as he attempted to run toward the door. But it was the leader, an older man with a grizzled face and a scar running down the side of his neck, who gave Carter the most trouble. The man drew his revolver, aiming straight at Carter. But Carter was faster. With a quick, precise motion, he fired first. The leader collapsed, his gun falling from his hand, and just like that, the fight in the church was over. Carter stood in the silence that followed, breathing heavily, his heart pounding. He had done it. The leaders were gone. The rest of the riders outside would break. Outside, the tide had already begun to turn. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leaders fall, hesitated. They began to falter, retreating, unsure of whether to fight or flee. The townsfolk pushed forward, their fire growing fiercer with every passing second. The sound of hooves grew faint as the remaining riders turned and rode off, retreating into the distance, their morale shattered. Carter stepped out of the church, his revolver still raised, his body aching with exhaustion. The battle was over. The town had won. But Carter knew better than to celebrate. The bounty on his head wasn't gone, and the outlaws would return. They always did. This wasn't over. Not yet. But for tonight, Crossbones Ridge had survived. And as Carter watched the people of the town gather in the square, standing together, he realized that maybe, just maybe, they could hold on. Maybe they could fight for a future. And as long as they had that, they had a reason to keep fighting. The streets of Crossbones Ridge were eerily still in the aftermath of the battle. The once bustling town, now scarred by gunfire and dust, carried an air of reluctant peace. Carter stood in the square, looking out at the people who had fought alongside him, people who had faced down death and come out on the other side. They were battered, bruised, and tired, but they had won. For now, his heart still pounded in his chest, the adrenaline of the fight slowly giving way to exhaustion. But the victory wasn't as sweet as he had hoped. It never was, in the West. Every victory was followed by another battle, another fight for survival. And Carter knew this was only temporary. The bounty hunters, the outlaws, they would return. It was only a matter of when. The townsfolk were already beginning to gather, talking amongst themselves in hushed voices. There was a mix of pride and worry in the air. They had held the line, but the cost was high. Maggie was still unconscious, and there were others wounded, some of them badly. They would need time to heal, but time was a luxury they couldn't afford. Carter walked over to Clara, who was standing near the church, her rifle slung across her back, her face drawn but resolute. Her hands were trembling slightly, but she didn't let on, not in front of the others. "You did good," Carter said quietly as he approached her. Clara gave him a tired smile. "So did you," she replied, her eyes scanning the horizon. "But this isn't over. You know that, right?" Carter's gaze shifted to the far edge of town, where the dust still hung in the air from the battle. He could feel it in his bones, the calm before the next storm. "I know," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of it. "I know." Clara took a deep breath, looking him square in the eye. "We're not just fighting for survival anymore, Sam. We're fighting for the future of this town, and for all of us." Her words hung in the air, carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore. Carter had never thought of himself as a man who could lead, not in the way that Clara was suggesting. But now, standing side by side with the people of Crossbones Ridge, he realized something. He didn't have to do this alone. They had all chosen to fight, and they had fought for each other. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light across the town. Carter felt the fatigue in his bones, but he also felt something else, something stronger, a sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for this town, for the people who had chosen to stand by him, and together, they would find a way to survive whatever came next. "We're not giving up, Sam," Clara said, her voice firm and steady. "And neither are you." Carter turned to her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I don't plan on it," he replied, "but we need to be ready. We need to make sure they know we won't be easy targets. We have to show them that Crossbones Ridge isn't a place to be taken." "I know," Clara said, nodding, "and we'll be ready." As the night drew on, the people of the town began to gather together in the saloon, their voices low as they discussed what needed to be done next. Carter stood at the front, his hand resting on the edge of a table, his mind working through every possible strategy. He knew that the town needed more than just guns. They needed unity. They needed to be prepared for anything. Sheriff Jackson approached him, his face set in a determined expression. "We've got a few people we can count on for backup, but we're still outnumbered," he said quietly. "We'll need supplies, more ammunition, and we need to make sure the town's defenses are secure." Carter nodded. He knew the sheriff was right. They were outnumbered, and the outlaws would keep coming. But they had something that the outlaws didn't have: determination, and a reason to fight. "We'll make it work," Carter said, his voice steady. "We have to. This town belongs to us now. We'll make sure they know that." The next few days were spent preparing for the worst. The townsfolk worked together, reinforcing the town's defenses, gathering what supplies they could, and making sure everyone had what they needed to hold the line. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Every man, woman, and child knew what was at stake, and they were ready to face whatever came their way. But as the days passed and the dust settled, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. He could feel it in the air, the pressure, the unease. The outlaws were out there, watching, waiting. They hadn't forgotten about Crossbones Ridge, and sooner or later, they would return. Carter stood at the church, looking out over the town as the sun began to set. The wind carried the scent of dust and earth, and the silence was oppressive, as if the world was holding its breath. Clara came up beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice soft but knowing. Carter didn't look at her right away. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, his mind racing with thoughts of the future. "I'm thinking we're just getting started," he said quietly. Clara turned to him, her gaze steady. "Whatever happens, Sam, we'll face it together." Carter nodded, a sense of quiet gratitude settling over him. He had always been a man of the gun, a man who lived by the sword, but now, standing beside Clara and the people of Crossbones Ridge, he knew that he was more than just a gunslinger. He was a protector, and he wasn't going to let them down. The future was uncertain. The outlaws would return. The bounty hunters would keep coming. But for now, Crossbones Ridge was safe, and Carter would make sure it stayed that way. With Clara by his side, the people of the town at his back, Carter knew that, no matter what, they would face the future together. And together, they would fight for their home, their lives, and their future. And this time, they wouldn't back down. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for another special story.